Colorado Territory, July 1868. A lone stranger rides in across the burning prairie. She gripped the branch and didn't move. He pulled up his horse, raised both hands, slow, palms empty. "I'll stay right here until you tell me otherwise." She stared him down. Sprained ankle, no papers, no wagon in sight. She lowered the branch halfway. "What exactly are you proposing?" A woman who lost everything on the open prairie and found more than she ever thought she deserved. Follow now so you don't miss what's next. The sun had no mercy out here. Genevieve Prescott had learned that in the first hour. By the second, she stopped being surprised by it. By the third, she simply accepted it, the way you accept a fact that cannot be changed, the way you accept that water is wet, or that fire burns, or that the people who were supposed to love you sometimes don't. The Colorado Territory in July of 1868 did not care who you were. It did not care that you had grown up in a brownstone on Beacon Hill, that you had studied Latin and French, that your mother had owned real silver candlesticks, and your father had kept a library of 400 books. The prairie cared about none of that. It only asked one question: can you survive? Gina was still working out her answer. She sat in the dirt beside the wreckage of her trunk, a beautiful thing once. Cherry wood with brass fittings, the kind her mother had packed with such careful hands. Now it was split down the middle, its contents half scattered across the cracked earth. One wheel of the wagon had clipped it on the way out. Accident or intention, she could not say for certain. She was beginning to suspect intention. The wagon train was gone. Her aunt and uncle were gone. Every other soul in that party was gone. She had woken to silence and already blazing heat. Her cheek pressed against the ground, her ankle throbbing from where she had fallen from the wagon in the chaos of the night before, had been helped to fall. Again, she could not say for certain. She was beginning to suspect intention about that too. Gina pressed 2 fingers to her ankle and hissed through her teeth. Sprained, not broken. She had read enough medical texts to know the difference, though she had never expected to need that knowledge quite like this. She looked around. Grass, brown and brittle. Sky, enormous and white with heat. A single line of wheel ruts running east, already filling with blown dust, already forgetting the wagons that made them. A cluster of dead cottonwood trees 30 yards to her left, their branches stripped bare and pale as old bone. No town, no road, no person. She counted what she had. The trunk, mostly destroyed, but yielding a few things still intact: a wool traveling coat that was useless in this heat, a book of arithmetic she had grabbed on instinct, 2 handkerchiefs, and her mother's silver locket, which she had been sleeping with pressed in her fist. Her identification papers, the documents that proved she was Genevieve Ann Prescott, age 22. Legal heir to the Prescott land holdings, were gone. She checked the trunk 3 times. Gone. She thought about crying. She decided against it. Crying was something she could do later. When the problem of surviving the afternoon was resolved, Gina stood up. Her ankle screamed at her. She stood anyway. The silk dress she was wearing was the wrong color for this sun-deep burgundy, soaking up heat like a furnace door. She looked at it for a moment, then looked at her ankle, then made a decision. She reached down to the hem and tore. The silk resisted, then gave. She tore a long strip from the underskirt, sat back down, and began wrapping her ankle with the kind of firm, even pressure she had read about. Not perfect. Better than nothing. She tied it off and stood again. Bearable. She could walk. She tucked her mother's locket inside the neckline of her dress, where she could feel it against her sternum. A small thing. But small things mattered out here. She was beginning to understand that too. The cottonwood trees were the only shade in any direction, so she made for them, limping, carrying the arithmetic book under one arm because leaving it felt wrong. The ground was pale and hard and seemed to radiate heat upward from below, as much as the sun drove it down from above. She was caught between 2 fires. She walked anyway. In the shade of the dead trees, she allowed herself 1 full minute to simply breathe. Then she started thinking. Her Uncle Clement had done this deliberately. She had known for months that something was wrong, the way he handled her father's estate papers. The whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room, The document he had pressed her to sign last spring that he claimed was a property transfer for tax purposes. She had signed it. She had been foolish enough to sign it, but she had also memorized every word on that page before her pen touched it, and she knew what it actually said. It was not a tax document. It was a declaration of mental incompetence. Her own signature on a paper declaring that she, Genevieve Ann Prescott, was of unsound mind and unfit to manage her own affairs, which meant her affairs, her father's land, her father's savings, everything transferred to the nearest male relative, to Clement. She had confronted him. He had smiled. He had said she was imagining things, that she was overwrought, that her nerves had been fragile since her parents' passing, that perhaps she needed rest. He had said this very kindly. She had wanted to throw a candlestick at him. Instead, she had started keeping notes, writing down dates and conversations, building a record. She had been careful. She had been patient. She had planned to take her evidence to a lawyer in Denver once they arrived. They had never made it to Denver. She leaned her back against one of the pale, dead trunks and closed her eyes. 100 degrees if it was anything. The air smelled like dust and dried grass, and something faintly metallic underneath the smell of a place that had not seen rain in a long time. She heard the horse before she saw it. Hoofbeats. One horse, moving at an easy trot, coming from the north. She was on her feet before the sound fully registered, which surprised her. Her body had already decided that she could not afford to be found sitting down. She looked around for anything useful. The stripped cottonwood branches were mostly too high to reach, but one had fallen and lay partly buried in the dirt. She pulled it free. It was about 4 feet long, dead and dry and light as paper, but it had some heft in the middle, and it would have to do. She stood at the edge of the cottonwood shade and watched the rider come. He was tall in the saddle. That was the first thing she noticed. The horse was a dark bay, solid and well kept. And the man rode it the way some walk through a room they know well. Easy, unhurried. He wore a dust-colored canvas coat over a dark shirt, a hat pulled low against the sun, and he carried a rifle in the saddle scabbard on his left. When he was close enough to see her, he pulled the bay to a slow stop. They looked at each other. He was older than her by a good 10 years or more, she guessed. Angular face, weathered brown, a jaw that had not seen a razor in several days. Eyes that were a strange pale color under the shadow of his hat brim gray or green. She could not tell from here. Not unkind eyes, not anything she could read clearly. She had been wrong about eyes before. She held the branch in both hands. The horse shifted its weight. The man looked at the branch, then back at her face. He did not reach for his rifle. He did not speak yet. He just looked like he was reading something and wanted to get it right before he reacted. Then he nudged the horse back one full step and reached up slowly with both hands. He pushed his hat back from his face. Then he held both hands up, open, palms out, empty. The gesture of a man who had made the calculation that being clearly harmless was the only sensible response to a woman standing alone in the heat, holding a stick like she meant business. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was low, not particularly loud, the voice of a man used to being heard without having to shout. "I can see you're armed, and I'm going to stay until you tell me to do otherwise." She said nothing. She kept her grip on the branch. "My name is Harker Vane," he said. "I run a cattle operation about 4 miles northeast of here. Ironwood Creek Ranch," he paused. "The name means nothing to you, and that's fine. I'm not asking you to trust it." She studied him. "You're alone?" "Rode out to check on a fence line." "Yes, I'm alone." "Where's the nearest town?" "Ironwood," he said. 7 miles west. About 2 hours on foot, less on horseback." His eyes moved briefly to her ankle, to the silk wrapped around it, and back up. He didn't comment on it. "It's approximately 100 degrees today, ma'am. You've been in the sun for a while, by the look of things. I'm aware of the temperature." "I don't doubt it." He lowered his hands slowly, not reaching for anything, just lowering them to a resting position, forearms on the saddle horn. "Can I ask what happened here?" She thought about how much to say. She thought about the branch in her hands, and the 4 miles to his ranch, and the 7 miles to town, and the 100 degrees, and her ankle. She thought about the kinds of men who held their hands up when a woman pointed a stick at them, and the kinds who laughed. This one had held his hands up. My wagon party left, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Left you? Yes. He looked out at the wheel ruts in the dust, already half filled with blown earth. He looked at the shattered trunk and its scattered contents. He looked back at her. Whatever he was thinking, his face kept it mostly to himself, but something moved behind his eyes. Something that was not pity exactly. Something more solid than pity. That's not something that happens by accident, he said. No, she agreed. It isn't. He took a slow breath through his nose. Miss Prescott. Genevieve Prescott. Miss Prescott. He squared his shoulders, and when he spoke again, there was something different in his voice. Deliberate. Like a man choosing each word because it mattered. I won't step closer without your permission. Out here on the prairie, or in a Boston parlor, respect is the first thing a man owes a woman. She stared at him. He met her eyes and didn't look away. She had heard many things said to her by many men in her 22 years. She had heard compliments and condescension, and instructions and apologies, and explanations for why she was wrong about things she was not wrong about. She had heard a great deal. She was not sure she had ever heard exactly that, said in exactly that tone plain as a fact. No flourish, no performance. She lowered the branch, not all the way, halfway. What are you proposing? She asked. I'm proposing that you're in trouble, and I have a ranch 4 miles that way, with water and shade and a spare room. He said it the way you'd say the sky is north of us. I'm not proposing anything beyond that. You'd be a guest. You'd have a door that locks from inside, and tomorrow, or the next day when you're ready, we can figure out what you want to do next. She looked at him for a long moment. She was running calculations, she knew it, and didn't apologize to herself for it. This was not a situation for poetry. This was a situation for arithmetic. She was hurt. She was dehydrated. She was alone in the open with no papers and no money and no way to prove who she was. The nearest town was 7 miles away. Her ankle would not carry her 7 miles today, not in this heat. The shade of these dead trees would last another 2 hours before the sun moved and left her exposed. Against that, one man on a horse who had pulled back and raised his hands and spoken to her like she was a person with rights and opinions. The branch was very light. It would not stop a determined man. She already knew that. She let it fall to the ground. 4 miles, she said. 4 miles, he confirmed. He swung down from the saddle slowly, making his movements visible, nothing sudden, and went to his saddlebag. He pulled out a canteen and walked toward her at an angle, not straight at her, and stopped when he was still several feet away. He set the canteen down on the ground between them and stepped back. She walked forward and picked it up. The water was warm and tasted of metal, and she had never been so grateful for anything in her life. She drank 3 swallows and made herself stop. She retrieved her arithmetic book and the 2 handkerchiefs and her coat and left the rest of the wreckage. There was nothing else worth taking. He helped her onto the horse. She would not have asked, but her ankle made it necessary, and he seemed to understand that, offering his hand without comment, no expression of sympathy that would have felt like a performance. Just a hand and a steadied stirrup, and she was up. He swung up behind her. There was no other configuration that made sense with one horse, and took the reins around her in a way that gave her space, some kind of conscious geometry to it, like he was trying to take up as little room as possible. He turned the horse northeast, and they started moving. The prairie rolled out ahead of them, brown and enormous and completely indifferent. The wind had picked up a little, still hot, but moving. The horse's gait was smooth and even. She held her arithmetic book in her lap and her mother's locket against her chest, and watched the cottonwood trees fall behind. After a moment, his voice came from just behind her shoulder. Quiet, not trying to fill up the silence, just offering something into it. They left you alone on this prairie, he said, but I won't. You're coming home with me. She didn't answer right away. There wasn't an answer that fit the size of what he had just said, so she didn't try to find one. She looked out at the land all that distance, all that heat and dust and enormous cracked sky, and she felt something she had not expected to feel. Not relief, exactly. Not safety. It was too early for safety. She knew that, but something like the first possibility of it. The horse carried them northeast, toward Ironwood Creek. and the wheel ruts behind them filled slowly with dust. And the prairie kept its silence, and Genevieve Prescott held on. The ranch appeared before she expected it to. One moment there was nothing but grass and distance, and then the land dipped slightly and rose again, and there it was, a cluster of buildings against the late afternoon sky, dark and solid and real, in a way that almost startled her. A main house, 2 stories, built from rough-hewn timber that had weathered to silver gray, a barn beside it, larger than the house, and a series of low outbuildings fanning out from there. A fence line running north to south, and inside it, cattle, maybe 60 head, maybe more standing in the long amber light. A working place, not a pretty place, a place that meant business. Gina looked at it and felt the tight wire she had been holding inside herself for the last several hours loosened by exactly 1 degree. A dog came out to meet the horse, a big mixed-breed animal, brown and white, tail moving in wide, slow arcs. Harker said, "That's Scout," from behind her, and the dog seemed to understand the introduction because it looked up at Gina with calm amber eyes and then trotted alongside them the rest of the way to the front of the house. A ranch hand came from the direction of the barn, a lean older man with a gray beard and the permanently squinting expression of someone who had spent decades looking into sun and wind. He stopped when he saw Gina on the horse with Harker. "Mr. Vane," he said. His voice carried no particular surprise, just acknowledgement. "Cal." Harker swung down and held the horse steady. "Found her out near the dead cottonwoods by Marker Flat. Wagon party left her." He said it plainly. No drama, like he was reporting a fence break. "She'll be staying until she's ready to move on. Get some water heating for the washroom." Cal looked at Gina for one measured moment, nodded once, and went back toward the outbuildings without another word. She appreciated that. She was very tired of being looked at. Harker helped her down. She put weight on her wrapped ankle, and it held barely. He noticed she could tell by the way he moderated his pace toward the front door, matching her without making a display of it. The interior of the house was dim and cool after the outside heat, which felt like stepping into a different world entirely. Plain, almost stark. A main room with a stone fireplace, a long table, 4 chairs, a shelf of practical items. A kitchen beyond it, visible through a doorway, stairs rising against the far wall. Nothing decorative, except for one thing. On the mantel above the fireplace, a small framed photograph. A woman in it, young, with dark hair and a composed expression. Gina noted it and looked away. It was not her business. Then she heard a sound from the staircase, a small foot on a wooden step. Then another. She looked up. The child was standing halfway down the stairs, one hand on the railing, completely still. 7 years old, perhaps, though she was slight enough that Gina might have guessed younger. Dark hair loose around her face. She was wearing a plain cotton dress that was slightly too large at the shoulders. Her eyes the same strange pale color as her father's, Gina saw now, and in this light they were definitely more gray than. Green were fixed on Gina with an expression that was not hostile. Exactly. Guarded, like a small animal that had been surprised before and was making sure not to be surprised again. "Tessa," Harker said. His voice went different when he said it. Still quiet, but softer at the edges. "Come on down." The girl moved down 2 more steps and stopped. She did not speak. Gina did not make the mistake of moving toward her, or smiling too broadly, or saying something bright and cheerful. She had read enough about children who had been through grief to know that cheerfulness from strangers could feel like an insult. Instead, she simply met the girl's eyes and said, "Hello," and left it at exactly that. Tessa looked at her for another moment. Then she looked at her father. Then she came the rest of the way down the stairs and went to stand beside him, one hand finding the fabric of his coat and holding it. Harker put a hand briefly on the top of her head. "This is Miss Prescott. She's going to stay with us for a while." He said it to Tessa the same way he had said everything else, direct, no elaborate framing, trusting the child to understand plain words. "She's had a hard day." Tessa looked at Gina again, her expression shifted by some small, private degree. Not quite less guarded, but perhaps listening, Gina agreed. She looked at the girl steadily. "I'm glad to be here." Harker showed her the room on the 2nd floor, at the end of the short hallway. across from Tessa's. It was small. A bed with a wool blanket, a washstand, a window looking west, a single wooden chair. Nothing extra. But it was clean, and it was solid, and the window glass was real glass, not oilcloth, and the floor didn't shift underfoot. He paused in the doorway. From his coat pocket, he produced a key, an ordinary iron key. Nothing remarkable about it, and held it out to her. "This room is yours," he said. "Nobody, including me, has the right to cross this threshold unless you invite them in." She took the key. He pointed to the interior of the door, where a bolt had been installed, the kind you throw from inside. Heavy iron. The bolt and the key both work. Use whichever you prefer. Use both if you want. He stepped back out into the hallway. "Cal will have water heated in about half an hour. I'll leave some of my late wife's things outside the door. She was closer to your size than anything else I have. You can use them or not. Your choice." He turned to go. "Mr. Vane." He stopped. "Thank you," she said. It came out simply because she meant it simply no performance. He nodded once. Then he went back downstairs. She closed the door and threw the bolt and stood in the middle of the small room and let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere very deep, somewhere she hadn't been able to reach all day. She looked at the key in her hand. It was, she thought, such a small thing. A key, a bolt, a door. And yet she could not remember the last time she had been given both a room and a lock and been told they were hers. In her Uncle Clement's house in Boston, after her parents died, her room had not locked. She had known that and never quite said it aloud. She sat on the edge of the bed and pressed the key between her palms and gave herself exactly 5 minutes. Then she got up and looked out the window. The sun was going down fast now, the way it did out here, without the buildings and trees of a city, to break the sky into manageable pieces. The whole western horizon was burning orange and deep red, and the cattle in the pasture below were dark shapes moving slowly through it. She counted them, 63 head. She noted the condition of the fence line visible from here. She observed the position of the barn relative to the prevailing wind direction from the west, which was sensible placement. She cataloged these things automatically, the way she always cataloged things, because a mind that was busy with what could be observed and measured was a mind that was not falling apart. Half an hour later, she heard Harker's footsteps in the hall, and then nothing, and then she opened the door and found a folded pile of clothing on the floor outside. A dark wool dress, practical, a cotton underskirt, a heavy shawl. She brought them inside. She kept the key in her pocket every moment from that point forward. The water Cal had heated was in a tub, in a small lean-to off the back of the kitchen, and it was the single finest thing she had experienced in recent memory. She cleaned 3 layers of Prairie off herself, rewrapped her ankle with a strip of clean cloth she found on the washstand shelf, and put on the dead woman's dress. It was a little loose in the waist and a little short at the hem. She rolled the sleeves once, straightened the collar, and went downstairs. Dinner was beans and cornbread and salt pork, and Harker dished it out at the long table without ceremony. Cal ate with them, as did a second ranch hand she hadn't seen before, a young Mexican man named Eli, who nodded at her respectfully and focused on his food. Tessa sat beside her father with a cup of warm milk and ate without speaking, but her eyes moved around the table with a quiet attentiveness that missed nothing. After dinner, Cal and Eli went out to finish the evening checks on the livestock. Harker stayed at the table with a cup of coffee, going through what looked like a ledger book, frowning at it with the concentrated expression of a man trying to make numbers cooperate that did not wish to cooperate. Gina washed the dishes. Nobody had asked her to. It was simply a task that needed doing, and she was there and capable of doing it. She was on the last bowl when Harker said from the table, "You don't have to do that, I know," she said. She finished and dried her hands and looked out the kitchen window at the sky, which had gone full dark now, enormous and dense with stars. More stars than she had ever seen in Boston. The city's gas lamps washed them out. Out here there was nothing between you and all of it. The cold came fast after the sun went down. She had not expected that the ferocity of the temperature drop, how quickly the 100-degree afternoon became a sharp desert night. She had read about it. Reading about it and feeling it were different things. Harker looked up from his ledger. Firewood for the bedroom stove is in the box on the porch. Takes a minute to catch. I'll manage, she said. She did not, in fact, manage immediately. She found the wood box on the porch split logs, good dry ones, easy to carry. She found the small iron stove in her room and the tin box of matches beside it. She had watched fireplaces being built all her life, by servants, by staff, by people whose job it was. She had never built one herself. The first match broke. The second she held too long and burned her fingers. The third she applied correctly to the crumpled paper she had found in the kindling box and got a flame, but loaded the wood too fast and smothered it. She knelt in front of the stove on the cold floor and started again with fresh paper and two small sticks first, and this time she waited, and the flame took, and she added the wood slowly. It caught. She stayed kneeling there for a moment, watching the fire establish itself, feeling the first breath of warmth come out from the open stove door. Her hands were red from the cold, and one finger had a small burn blister rising on it. She looked at both hands. Boston hands. Soft hands that had held pen and paper and book, and nothing much heavier than that. She thought, I will need different hands. And then she thought, I can get different hands. In the morning, it was better. The ranch had a rhythm to it, and rhythm was something she understood. She was up before full light, which surprised her a little. The sound of Cal, moving around in the kitchen below, had pulled her from sleep, and she had found herself unable to lie still. She dressed and came downstairs. Cal glanced at her, nodded, and went back to what he was doing, which was frying salt pork and boiling coffee. He was not an unfriendly man, she decided. He was simply a man who communicated in the minimum number of words required, and no more, which she found restful. Harker came down shortly after. He saw her at the table with a coffee cup and appeared to revise some expectation he had been carrying. He said nothing about it. He poured his own coffee and sat across from her, and they existed in the same space in a comfortable quiet, while the sky went from black to gray to the particular pale gold that preceded actual sunrise out here. The chopping block is around the back, he said eventually. If you need something to do. She looked at him. Is that a suggestion? It's information. He turned a page in his ledger. What you do with it is your business. After breakfast, she went around the back of the house. The chopping block was a thick section of tree trunk about 2 feet across, standing upright in a cleared patch of dirt. Beside it, a stack of larger logs waiting to be split, and an axe embedded in the block itself. Around the block, the evidence of recent work wood chips, bark fragments, the accumulated record of many mornings. She looked at the axe. She had never used one. She pulled it free, heavier than it looked. The handle was worn smooth in the grip, decades of hands shaping it to a kind of readiness. She set a log on the block, stood back, and tried to remember anything useful she had ever read about splitting wood. The first swing was a disaster. The axe glanced off the side of the log and planted itself in the dirt beside the block, and nearly twisted out of her grip. She recovered, reset her footing, and tried again. This time the blade hit center but didn't go through. She didn't have the weight behind it. The log sat there, the axe stuck an inch into its top. She wiggled it free. She thought about what she was doing wrong, balance, mostly, and she was swinging with her arms instead of letting the weight of the axe head do the work. She repositioned her feet wider. She raised the axe, and this time at the peak of the swing she let it fall with gravity rather than fighting to drive it down. The logs split cleanly. The sound of it, that clean crack, the two halves falling apart, was unexpectedly satisfying in the cold morning air. She stood and looked at it for a moment. Then she set another log on the block. By the time the sun was fully up, she had split most of the waiting pile. Her hands were burning. Her shoulder muscles were complaining. She could feel the blister from last night's match on her right index finger, now rubbed raw inside the work glove she had borrowed from the porch hook. She stacked what she'd split along the side of the house, the way she'd seen it done in woodcuts in her father's agricultural books, bark side up against moisture, ends out. Then she came back around the front and sat on the porch step and looked at her hands. Tessa was there. She was sitting on the far end of the porch, legs folded under her, watching. She had been silent enough that Gina hadn't known she was there. They looked at each other. Tessa's gaze dropped to Gina's hands, then came back up to her face. Gina turned her palms up and looked at them too. "First time I've split wood," she said. "I imagine it'll take some practice before I'm any good at it." Tessa said nothing, but she kept her eyes on Gina with that same careful attention, not blank, not closed off. More like she was adding information to something she was already working out. "In Boston, where I'm from," Gina said, keeping her voice conversational, not pushing anything, "I spent most of my time indoors, reading mostly. Mathematics." She paused. "I know quite a lot about things I've never actually done." She looked at the red marks on her palms. "Turns out there's a difference." Tessa looked at her hands again. "That's true for most people," Gina said. "Knowing something in your head and knowing it in your hands are two different kinds of knowing. Both matter, but they don't replace each other." She had no idea if this meant anything to the child. She wasn't saying it to be wise. She was saying it because it was what she was thinking. She heard Harker's boots on the boards behind her. He came around the corner of the house, saw the stacked wood, stopped. He looked at the stack for a moment. Then he looked at Gina's hands. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "You said the same thing about the dishes, and you gave me the same answer, because it was still true." She stood up, testing her ankle. "Better than yesterday. Considerably better. Mr. Vane, I want to be useful while I'm here, not out of obligation, and not because I'm trying to earn the room, because it's better to work than to sit still." He looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his expression, not exactly approval, something quieter than that. Recognition, maybe. "Fair enough," he said. He came up the porch steps and paused beside Tessa, who had not moved from her spot. He crouched down to her level without making a production of it, just down to her height, and looked at her face with a searching expression. She looked back at him. A whole conversation passed between them without a word. Gina watched it happen and felt she was seeing something private. She looked away. Inside later, she found his ledger on the table where he'd left it open that morning. She had not meant to read it, but it was open, and she had walked past it, and she had happened to see it, and what she saw was concerning. The columns were inconsistent. The notation system changed partway through, and whoever had changed it had compounded an error from 4 pages earlier into every entry since. It would have looked fine to someone who didn't know what they were looking for. To Gina, who had spent the better part of 6 years helping her father manage his accounts, and who had a natural aptitude for figures that had always slightly embarrassed her in Boston drawing rooms, it was visible as clearly as a smudge on clean glass. She didn't touch it. She went and sat by the window. That evening, after dinner, when Harker opened the ledger again, with his cup of coffee and his frown, she said, "May I look at something?" He glanced up. "The ledger?" "I noticed something this morning. I wasn't prying. It was open." She met his eyes steadily. "I could be wrong." He pushed it across the table without hesitation. That surprised her, not the gesture exactly, but the speed of it, no deliberation. He simply pushed it across and waited. She pulled it toward her and opened to the page she remembered. Found the error, traced it back to its source. Then she took the small pencil from beside the inkstand and, on a clean page, began working it out. It didn't take long, 10 minutes, maybe. When she was done, she turned the paper toward him and showed him the difference between his current totals and what the totals should be. He looked at it. He looked at it for a long time. "That's $112, he said. 114. You also miscounted this column." She pointed. He sat back. He looked at her. "Where did you learn this?" "My father taught me," she said. He believed. She stopped because she had been about to say, he believed girls ought to know arithmetic the same as boys, but that was not quite right. What her father had actually said once, when her governess had suggested she spend more time on music and less on sums, was, "A person who can't manage their own accounts is dependent on whoever manages them for them, and that is a poor position for anyone." He had meant it practically, not politically, though it had amounted to the same thing. He believed everyone should know how to do their own accounts, she said, that it wasn't a skill that belonged to any particular kind of person. Harker was quiet for a moment. "He was right," he said simply. She slid the ledger back across the table. "I could look through the rest of it," she said. "If you want. I'm not offering to take it over. I'm offering a second set of eyes." He picked up the ledger. He looked at the corrected page. He looked at her. "Tomorrow," he said. "We'll look at it tomorrow." She went upstairs not long after. She bolted the door, not because she feared anything, but because the bolt was hers to use and she chose to use it. She set the key on the washstand where she could see it. Outside the window, the prairie was fully dark and fully quiet. The cold was serious now the stove was going, the fire she had built herself, and she had built it right this time, on the first try. She lay in the bed and thought about the day. The axe, the ledger, Tessa on the porch watching her with those serious eyes, the key on the washstand. She thought about Harker Vane, who handed keys to women and pushed ledgers across tables without hesitation and crouched down to a mute child's level without making a display of it. She had not figured him out yet. She did not entirely trust her ability to figure people out. That mistake, the one with Clement and the document, had made her cautious in a new way. But she was watching. She was paying attention. That was, in the end, what she had. A good mind and a habit of watching. The hands would come with time. She fell asleep faster than she expected to, in the small room that was hers, behind the door that locked from inside. 2 weeks passed. Gina had not expected to still be at Ironwood Creek after 2 weeks. She had told herself, in those first raw days, that she would stay until her ankle healed, until she had a plan, until she knew what her next move was. The ankle healed in 5 days. The plan took longer. The problem was not the thinking. She was very good at thinking. The problem was the doing specifically, the doing of anything useful when she had no papers, no money, no proof of who she was, and at least one corrupt mayor in the nearest town who had already demonstrated interest in claiming her as someone else's legal property. Going to Ironwood without a strategy was not a plan. It was an error. So she stayed. And while she stayed, she worked. The ranch's financial records turned out to be more disordered than that first ledger had suggested. Harker had been keeping his own books since his wife's death 3 years ago, and he was a competent man in most respects, but bookkeeping was not instinct for him. It was effort, and the effort showed. There were 3 different ledger systems running simultaneously, none of them talking to the others. Purchase records in one book, payroll in another, cattle sale records in a third, and no single document that reconciled all 3 into anything you could actually make decisions from. Gina built one. She worked at the long table every morning after breakfast, with Tessa sitting at the far end doing her own quiet business drawing, mostly small careful pictures on the backs of old pages that Gina had given her from a spare notebook. They kept each other company without requiring anything from each other, which suited them both. The work itself was absorbing. That was the word for it. She lost herself in it, in the logic of it, the way a properly balanced account had a satisfying internal order that felt almost like music, columns that agreed with each other, numbers that told a coherent story. She worked with a sharpened pencil and a separate sheet for calculations, checking and rechecking. And when she found a discrepancy, she traced it back to its source with the patience of someone who genuinely did not mind the search. Harker watched this. Not intrusively, he had his own work, always, and the ranch consumed him from first light to well past dark most days. But he noticed. She could tell he noticed, the same way she noticed things, quietly and from a distance. On the 10th day, he set a mug of coffee beside her, without comment while she was working, and stood looking at the pages she had laid out. "How far back did you go?" he asked. 18 months, she said. "That's as far back as the records allowed. And you've been over-ordering feed by approximately 30% because you had no way of tracking what was already on hand against what was being consumed." She turned one of the pages toward him. "Here. If you reduce the standing order and implement a simple inventory check every 2 weeks, you save, roughly," she calculated quickly in the margin. $60 over a winter quarter, she said. He looked at the number. He picked up the page and looked at it more closely. Then he set it back down. "Where did you study?" he said. "I didn't. Not formally. Women don't, generally." She said it plainly. No bitterness in it. It was simply fact of the world as it was arranged. "My father taught me." He had the theory that education belonged to whoever wanted it and had the capacity for it, and that restricting it by sex or circumstance was a waste the world couldn't afford. She paused. He was a practical man. He came to that conclusion practically. Harker was quiet for a moment. He sounds like he was a good man, he was. She turned to the next page. He's been gone 8 months now. My mother 6 months before that. She hadn't said that aloud to anyone since the Prairie. It came out simpler than she expected, more like a fact than a wound, which was not because it didn't hurt, it did. It would for a long time, but because she had learned that facts and wounds were not mutually exclusive. You could hold both. Harker sat down across from her. He wrapped both hands around his own coffee mug and looked at the surface of the table for a moment. "I'm sorry," he said. "Thank you." She meant it. She looked at him. This was something she found herself doing, more looking directly at him, trying to read the pages of him, the way she would a set of accounts. There was more there than was visible at first. She had understood that early. He was not a closed man exactly. He was a man who had gotten careful. "Tessa's mother?" she said. She kept her voice neutral, not pressing. "You don't have to talk about it." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not. Then he said, 3 years ago this past September. Ambush on the eastern road, coming back from Pueblo." He stopped. Started was in the wagon. "I was riding ahead habit from my cavalry days, scouting the road. I'd ridden maybe a quarter-mile ahead." He looked at his coffee. "By the time I heard the shots and got back, it was over." Gina said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't be smaller than what he'd just said. "Tessa was in the wagon with her," he said. "She was 4 years old. She wasn't hurt, not physically." He looked up briefly. "She hasn't spoken since that day. 4 years old, and she stopped again. The doctors in Pueblo said it sometimes happens. A shock of that kind that said, give it time." "It's been 3 years," Gina said quietly. "It's been 3 years," he agreed. He didn't say what she suspected he carried in that silence, that he blamed himself. That a cavalry scout who rode ahead and left his wife unguarded on a road he had not adequately assessed had no claim to call himself a scout at all. He didn't say it. But it was there, under every word, the same way an accounting error was there, even when the columns looked fine on the surface. "You didn't know?" she said. "I should have, Mr. Vane." She waited until he looked at her. "Knowing what's coming is not a thing any person can reliably do. You can prepare. You can be careful. You were careful. Riding ahead was careful. It was not enough. That is a tragedy. It is not the same as a failure of character." He looked at her for a long moment. "You have a way of saying things plainly," he said. "My father's influence," she said. He thought excessive decoration in language was a sign that the speaker wasn't sure of what they were saying. Something changed in Harker's expression. Not quite a smile, but close to it, in the vicinity of it. She filed that away. He picked up his coffee. She went back to the ledger. Outside, the wind came across the open land and pressed against the windows, and Tessa drew her small, careful pictures at the end of the table, and the morning held a kind of steadiness that Gina was not yet used to, but was beginning to recognize. The Derringer appeared on a Tuesday. Toward the end of the second week, Gina was out behind the barn, working on the chopping block. It had become her morning habit, an hour of wood before the ledger work, because it turned out her father had also been right about physical work, clearing the mind, which was something she was discovering practically. She had gotten better at it. The axe felt less foreign in her hands. She hit center more often than not, and she had stopped fighting the weight of the head and started using it. She heard Harker come around the corner of the barn, and she didn't stop. She finished the log she was on clean split, both halves falling neatly, and set the axe down and turned. He was holding something. She couldn't see it clearly until he was closer. A pistol, small, the smallest she had ever seen up close, double-barreled, with a dark wood grip and a nickel frame that caught the morning light. It sat in his palm, held flat, not pointed anywhere. She looked at it. Then she looked at him. "Come over here," he said. He moved toward the open field on the east side of the barn, away from the buildings, where a fence post stood out about 20 yards from where they were standing. He had already hung a square of folded canvas from it. She could see it now, a makeshift target. She followed him. He stopped and held the pistol out to her. "Grip first." "A Derringer," he said. 2 shots. Simple action. Light enough to carry in a dress pocket or a boot. She took it carefully. Lighter than she'd expected. but heavier than it looked, the way guns always were in illustrations. She turned it in her hands. "Have you handled a firearm before?" he asked. "No." "Then we start from the beginning." He moved to stand beside her, angled toward the target, and adjusted his own posture as a demonstration. "Feet wider than your shoulders. Right foot back, slightly. You're not planting yourself against a cannon, just giving yourself a stable base to make an accurate decision." She arranged her feet. "Raise it with both hands. Left hand supports, right hand controls. You're not fighting the pistol. You're agreeing with it about where it's going." She raised it, found the posture he was describing. It felt strange, but not unmanageable. "Line the sights up with the target," he said. "Don't overthink it. Your eye will do most of the work if you let it." He was close enough to correct her grip, but he didn't touch her hands. He talked her through it, showed her with his own hands in the air beside hers. "The trigger pull on that one is lighter than you expect. Take a breath. Let half of it out. Steady." She fired. The kick surprised her, not the size of it, but the existence of it. She had known intellectually that the gun would move. She had not known it in her hands. The shot went wide of the canvas square. She lowered the gun and looked at it. "Better than most people's first shot," he said. "You didn't close your eyes." "Closing my eyes seemed counterproductive. You'd be surprised." He gestured at the gun. "Second barrel." She raised it again. Found the posture faster this time. Lined up the sights. Let out the breath. The second shot hit the canvas square on the left edge. She lowered the gun and looked at the target for a moment. "Good," Harker said. He said it simply. "We'll do this every few days until it's not a decision anymore. Until it's just a thing you know how to do. Same as splitting wood." She turned the empty gun over in her hands. "You're teaching me to protect myself." "Yes, from strangers on the road." He looked at her directly. "From anyone who might try to make a decision for you. That's yours to make." She understood what he meant. She had understood it from the moment he held it out, grip first. But hearing it said plainly was something else. "Mr. Vane?" she said. "Why?" He took the empty pistol back and began reloading it from the small pouch he carried. His hands were practiced and efficient with it. "Because this world isn't safe for women yet," he said. "Not the way it ought to be. And I'm not teaching you to shoot so you can be a killer." He closed the loaded gun and held it out to her again. "I'm teaching you so. No man, myself included, can ever force you to do what you don't want." She took the gun. She stood with it in both hands and looked at the canvas target 20 yards away and thought about that sentence. "Myself included." 2 words that cost something to say and that he had said without apparent difficulty, as though it were simply the obvious thing. She thought about Clement, who had handed her a pen and guided her hand and told her to sign, and who had never in any conversation about her future thought to include those 2 words. She raised the gun and fired again. This time, she barely flinched at the kick. The shot hit dead center on the canvas square. Harker looked at the target. He looked at her. "You're a quick study," he said. "My father's influence?" she said again. He almost smiled. She was getting better at seeing it, the small shift that happened at the corners of his mouth when something amused him. The way he didn't quite let it become a full smile, but it was there regardless. She found it interesting. They walked back toward the house in the sharp morning air. Tessa was on the porch, and she had heard the shots. Gina could see it in the tension of her shoulders that was already releasing as Harker came into view. The girl looked at Gina's hands and saw the derringer and went still again, reading the situation. "Miss Prescott is learning to shoot," Harker told her. He said it the way he said everything to Tessa, direct, clear, trusting her to process it. "She's a good student." Tessa's eyes moved from the gun to Gina's face. Gina held the gun loosely at her side, nothing threatening in it, and met the girl's gaze. "It's all right," she said. "It's just a skill, like mathematics." Tessa considered this. She looked at the gun again. Then she looked at the canvas on target in the field, just barely visible from the porch. She looked back at Gina with an expression that was, as far as Gina could read it, something between solemn and thoughtful. Then she went back inside, and the door closed behind her. Harker watched her go. "She doesn't get spooked by the sounds the way she used to," he said quietly. "A year ago, she'd have hidden under the bed for an hour." "She's getting stronger," Gina said. "She is." He turned and looked out at the open land. "She sees things, that child. More than she lets on, I know," Gina said. I see her seeing them. They stood there for a moment, not speaking, on the porch of the house that was his, in the light of a Colorado morning that belonged to everyone and no one. Then Cal called from the barn with a question about the east fence line. And Harker went, and Gina went inside to the ledger. And the day arranged itself the way the days at Ironwood Creek were arranging themselves now, with a rhythm that was becoming familiar. 3 evenings later, Harker spread a territorial map across the table after dinner. This was not unusual. He used maps regularly, tracking grazing rotations and water sources and property lines. Gina had looked at them before with interest, because maps were a kind of account, a record of what existed and where, and the same logic that ordered a balance sheet could be applied to a piece of land. But this time he put his finger on a point about 12 miles southeast of Ironwood Creek and said, "Your family's land. Do you know exactly where it is?" She went still. "My father filed the claim in '64, she said carefully. "I have the filing reference number memorized. I don't have the physical deed. It was in the trunk." She paused. "Or Clement took it. I'm not certain which. The Territorial Land Office in Denver will have the original filing." He traced a line on the map with one finger. "The Prescott parcel is here, near Copper Ridge. It's been in your family's name for 4 years." He looked at her. "Have you been told what's on it?" She shook her head slowly. "Silver," he said. "Not a rumor. A confirmed deposit. The assay report went through Ironwood Town's land registry last spring." He folded his hands on the map. "Mayor Blackwood sits on the land registry board." The pieces moved into alignment in her mind. Quickly, the way they did when an accounting problem suddenly resolved all at once and completely. "That's what this is about," she said. "That's what this is about," he confirmed. She sat back. "Clement didn't just want my inheritance, the land value, the cattle, the savings that would have been enough for him. He wanted the silver. She worked through it, but the land is registered to my father's estate, which passes to me as sole heir. He couldn't simply take it. He needed me declared incompetent. He needed legal control of my affairs, which the document you signed gave him, which I signed." She looked at the map. "But the signature is only valid if I'm genuinely of unsound mind, which I'm not, or if I signed under conditions that could be characterized as free and informed, which I didn't." She looked up. "I was not told what I was signing. I was told it was a tax document. I was 22 years old and recently bereaved, and I was." She stopped. I trusted him. She'd said that last part without excusing it or dwelling on it. It was simply what had happened. "The fraudulent document can be challenged in court," Harker said. "The incompetence claim can be challenged. But you need standing to do that, and standing requires papers." He was choosing his words carefully, she noticed, laying it out as a set of problems rather than a verdict. "If you can get to Denver, to the Territorial Land Office, your father's original claim filing establishes your identity as his heir. That's the starting point. Getting to Denver without papers while there's a warrant out for my arrest is not straightforward," she said. "No." He was quiet for a moment. "I have some standing in this territory. Former military. Property owner of record. I can get you to Denver under my bond if it comes to that." She looked at him. "That's a considerable risk for you. I've assessed it, and your assessment is that it's worth it." He met her eyes. "My assessment is that a woman's legal right to exist as herself is not a thing I'll watch get stripped away because I found the risk calculation inconvenient." She held his gaze for a moment. There was nothing she could add to that. It was simply true, and he had said it without decoration, and she believed him. "All right," she said. He folded the map. "In the meantime," he said, "you keep working on those ledgers, and I keep working on the strategy, and we don't go into Ironwood Town until we have to." She nodded. "Agreed." He picked up his coffee and looked out the dark window. "There's something else you should know," he said. She waited. "Reed Blackwood is Orson Blackwood's brother, the mayor." He kept his voice level. "Reed also happens to be the brother of my late wife." She absorbed that. "He's Tessa's uncle, by blood." Harker's voice didn't change. "He blames me for her death, his sister's. He's held it since the day she died, and he has never let go of it." "Is he right to blame you?" She asked it the same way she had said everything else directly, without cruelty, because she thought he deserved a direct question more than a careful one. He was quiet for a long time. "He's not wrong that I wasn't there when she needed me," he said finally. "He's wrong about what that means, what I intended, what I should have done. But grief doesn't run on logic. He lost his sister. He needed somewhere to put that. He put it on you. He put it on me." She thought about that, and now he and the mayor are working together. Against you, against me, against the silver deposit, and anyone standing between them and it. He set his coffee cup down, which at the moment includes both of us. She looked at the folded map. She thought about 12 miles southeast, the ground holding silver deposits under thin Colorado soil, and Clement in some city, somewhere thinking he had won, and a mayor with warrants and a land registry board, and a man named Reed Blackwood, with grief he had sharpened into a weapon. "Then we'll need to be smarter than all of them," she said. Harker looked at her. This time the almost smile was clearer. The corners of his mouth moved enough to be unmistakable. "Yes," he said, "we will." On Saturday, she asked him about the shooting practice again, and he met her behind the barn and they worked for an hour. She was more consistent now. She hit the target more often than not, and she had gotten control of the flinch response that was the first instinct in anyone new to firearms. She was learning to breathe through it, to stay open and present at the moment that was hardest to stay open and present. Harker corrected her grip twice, both times with words, not touch. She appreciated the precision of that. Afterward, walking back, she said, "What do you do when you're frightened?" He glanced at her. "I mean, when you rode back and found she stopped. In that moment, what did you do?" He walked a few steps before he answered. "I kept moving," he said. "Not because the fear wasn't there. It was there. It was loud." He looked ahead. But moving was the only thing that made sense. The fear was information. What I did with the information was the part that was mine to control. She thought about that for the rest of the day. She thought about the morning on the prairie, the branch in her hands, the rider coming from the north, the calculation she had run while standing on a sprained ankle in 100-degree heat. She had been frightened then, thoroughly, but she had stood up and wrapped her ankle and picked up the branch. And those were her actions, chosen by her, in a situation that had tried to take all her choices away. The fear had been information. What she did with it had been hers. That evening, she sat at the long table while Tessa drew beside her, and the fire went in the hearth, and Harker's boots moved around upstairs with the unhurried sound of a man at the end of his day. She opened the ledger to the next section, July through September, cattle sale records, and began. The numbers organized themselves under her pencil. Order emerged from disorder. A coherent picture of a year's worth of work became visible on the page. Outside, the Colorado night was cold and full of stars, and somewhere, 12 miles southeast, the ground held silver that belonged to her. And somewhere in Ironwood town, a mayor was making plans, and the derringer was in her dress pocket, with 2 loaded chambers. She knew what she was up against. She had the full accounting of it now. She turned the page and kept working. The decision to go into town was not made lightly. Harker spent 3 days thinking about it before he said anything. Gina could tell there was a particular quality to his silence during those days, a focus behind his eyes, even when he was doing something else entirely. She had learned to read that in him. He was not a man who arrived at conclusions carelessly. On Wednesday morning, he came in from the barn, poured his coffee, and sat across from her at the table where she was already working. "We need supplies," he said. "Salt, flour, lamp oil, and the farrier in town needs to see the bay's left front shoe before she throws it." He wrapped both hands around his mug. "I think we go Friday." She set her pencil down. Together, together. He looked at her steadily. "I've thought about sending Cal, but if Blackwood has eyes on this ranch, and I believe he does, then Cal coming in without me for 2 weeks running changes the pattern. It signals something. A man managing his own affairs goes to town himself and brings a woman with him," she said. "And brings a woman with him," he confirmed, "which is also normal, which is also unremarkable." He paused, or it should be. She thought about the warrant. Warrant for an escaped lunatic, Harker had told her. Her Uncle Clement's paperwork, weaponized by Mayor Blackwood, turned into a legal instrument for putting her back into someone else's custody. back into the machinery they had built to strip her of everything. "I'll have the Derringer," she said. "You'll have the Derringer," he agreed. "And I'll have my service revolver, which I carry into town regardless, so that's unremarkable, too." He looked at her. "I'm not anticipating a fight. I'm anticipating theater. Blackwood is a political man. He'll want to perform, and we perform back. We go in as what? A rancher and his." He paused briefly, measuring the word. "Guest. Conducting business." She picked up her pencil again. "Friday," she said. "Friday." Tessa was not coming. This was understood without much discussion. Cal would stay with her, and Eli, and there was a third hand, a quiet man named Moss, who had worked the Ironwood Creek fence lines for 2 years and was built like a barn door. Tessa would be safe. She understood, at some level, that something serious was happening. She watched Harker with that particular alert stillness on Thursday evening, but she made no protest. She simply held his coat for an extra second when he said good night, and he held the back of her head for an extra second in return. And that was the whole of it. They left at first light Friday. The road to Ironwood Town ran west-northwest, 7 miles of packed dirt that had once been a cattle trail and still showed it in the irregularity of its surface. Harker drove a small flatbed wagon, the bay horse newly shod the previous week, Gina noted, so the farrier business was real, pulling them at an easy pace. Gina sat beside him on the bench. She wore the dark wool dress and the shawl, and she pinned her hair up as neatly as she could manage with the limited means available to her. She hoped like a woman, with entirely ordinary business in town. The Derringer was in her right dress pocket. She could feel its weight with every step the horse took. They didn't talk much on the road. The morning was cool and bright, the sky enormous and pale blue overhead, and the land ran flat and brown on either side of them with occasional stands of scrub oak breaking the line. Gina watched it go past and thought about what Harker had said. Theater, a performance. She had been educated in Boston drawing rooms where performance was its own discipline, where every social interaction had structure and stakes and subtext. She knew how to perform. She simply needed to remember that that was what this was. Ironwood Town appeared in the middle distance as a dark cluster of buildings against the treeless plain, maybe 30 structures. She could count them from this distance. A main street, a few cross streets, a water tower, a church steeple. Not small for a territorial town. Not small at all, which meant commerce, which meant the land registry, which meant real money flowing through here and real interest in keeping that flow directed correctly. As they came down the main street, she looked at everything. She did it methodically, the way she read a new set of accounts, establishing the layout first, the relationships between things, what was prominent and what was backgrounded. The general store, large and well-stocked by the look of the window displays. A land office with a painted sign, a saloon, a bank, which surprised her with its solidity proper stone front, not timber. A jail, a building at the far end with a wider porch, and a painted sign she couldn't read yet from here. She read it as they got closer. Mayor's office and territorial registry. "There," she said quietly. "I see it," Harker said. He did not look at it. He pulled the wagon up in front of the general store and climbed down and came around to her side. She took his offered hand and stepped down, and they went into the store together. The store owner was a broad woman in her 50s named Mrs. Aldridge, who looked at Gina with the particular measuring expression of a small-town woman evaluating a stranger, and arrived at some verdict within about 4 seconds that appeared to be cautiously favorable. Harker knew her, greeted her by name, received the same in return, and began working through the supply list with the ease of someone who had done this many times before. Gina moved through the store while he handled the ordering. She looked at the goods on the shelves with genuine interest. Bolts of fabric, some of them useful school slates, small chalkboards, chalk sticks. Books, she paused at those. A primer, a speller, an arithmetic workbook. She picked up the arithmetic workbook and turned it in her hands. Something was forming in her mind. Had been forming for days, actually, since she had started thinking about Tessa and about the conversation she'd had with Harker about his late wife's route through an unassessed road and about the children she'd seen twice now. On her rides around the property boundary with ragged children, watching from distances, from the edges of things. She set the arithmetic workbook on the counter beside Harker's supply order. Mrs. Aldridge looked at it. Looked at Gina. "I'll take 2 of those," Gina said, "and 2 of the spellers, and 4 slates." "That's a considerable order for 1 reader," Mrs. Aldridge said. "Not unfriendly, just observant." "It's for several," Gina said. She didn't say more. Mrs. Aldridge added the items to the list without pursuing it. They were nearly done, the supplies being loaded by the store's boy onto the wagon, the account being settled when the door of the general store opened. 2 men came in. No, 3. The third hung back in the doorway. The man in front was perhaps 50, broad in the shoulders, dressed considerably better than anyone else Gina had seen in Ironwood Town so far. A dark coat that fit properly, a hat that had been brushed recently, a watch chain visible at his vest. He had a big face, clean-shaved, with small pale eyes set wide apart, and he moved with the particular deliberateness of a man who was accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around his entrance. She knew the type. Boston had them too. The second man was taller, leaner, in a deputy's badge and a working man's coat, with his hand resting near, but not on his holster, in a posture that was practiced rather than natural. The third man in the doorway she couldn't see clearly. The broad man looked at Harker. Then he looked at Gina. "Harker Vane," he said. His voice was large and smooth, the voice of a man who had used it in many rooms. "It has been some time, Mayor," Harker said. He said it without warmth and without hostility. A neutral acknowledgement. Mayor Orson Blackwood let his gaze rest on Gina for a moment. "I don't believe I've met your companion." "Miss Prescott is a guest at my ranch," Harker said, passing through the territory. Blackwood nodded slowly. He reached into the inside breast pocket of his coat. What he produced was a folded paper, which he opened with the measured unhurry of a man who had rehearsed this and knew his audience would wait. "Warrant for an escaped lunatic," he said. He read from the paper, but his eyes stayed on Gina. Female, approximately 22 years of age, brown hair, educated speech. Answers to the name Genevieve Prescott. Considered a danger to herself and others. To be remanded to the custody of her legal guardian, Mr. Clement Rourke, by order of I'm familiar with it, Harker said. Then you're aware that harboring this individual constitutes. I'm aware of what the paper says. Harker's voice had not changed in volume or pace. It was still level, but it had gone to something harder underneath. I'm also aware that a warrant for lunacy requires certification by 2 physicians and a county magistrate under territorial law, and I'd be interested to see those certifications attached. Blackwood folded the warrant. The certifications are on file with the territorial. Where are the physicians' names? Harker said. On the warrant itself, which is the document in your hand. I didn't ask about a file. I asked about the names. A brief pause, small but visible. That information is Blackwood began. Because in my experience, Harker continued, still at the same level pace, a valid lunacy warrant carries the certifying physician's names and registration numbers on its face. Territorial Statute, 1865. I read it when I was posted here during the war. He looked at the mayor without blinking. If those names aren't on that document, it isn't a warrant. It's a letter. Mrs. Aldridge had gone very still behind her counter. The store boy had stopped moving. Blackwood's pale eyes had sharpened. Now, Harker, Mr. Vane, Harker said. You can call me Mr. Vane. The mayor looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the deputy. Some signal passed between them, and the deputy straightened and moved toward Gina. I'm going to ask the lady to come with us while this is. You're going to stop where you are, Harker said. The deputy stopped. Harker did not reach for his revolver. His hand was near it, had been near it, she realized, since Blackwood had walked in the same practiced readiness she had seen in him on the prairie that first day. Not threatening, just positioned. Miss Prescott is a guest on my property and under my protection, Harker said. He addressed the mayor, not the deputy. I am posting a property bond for her presence in this territory as a free woman of sound mind, which any citizen with established land title and military service record can do under territorial code. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document of his own. She had not known he was carrying it, but of course he was, and held it out. This is a certified copy of my land title and service record, which I had drawn up in Denver last spring. It meets the bond requirements. Blackwood did not take the paper. This isn't a matter of a bond, the mayor said. His smooth voice had developed an edge. This is a matter of a woman's legal custodianship. Custodianship requires incompetence, Harker said. Incompetence requires valid certification. Valid certification requires names on the warrant. He held the bond paper steady. I'll take the warrant and the certifications to the territorial magistrate in Denver and let him rule on the validity. In the meantime, Miss Prescott is free. He looked at the mayor with something that was not anger, not quite, but was the thing that comes just before anger and is sometimes more effective. That is not a negotiation. That is the law. The silence in the store held for a long moment. Gina had not moved. She was standing beside the counter with her hand in her dress pocket and the Derringer's grip under her fingers, and she was watching Orson Blackwood's face with the same focus she brought to a set of accounts, looking for the number that didn't fit. He was calculating. She could see it happening, the revised assessment of Harker's preparation, the reset of his own strategy, the decision about what the right move was from here. He arrived at a conclusion. He smiled. It was an impressive smile, wide and completely uninformative about what was behind it. Of course, he said, no one is suggesting anything improper. We simply want to ensure that Miss Prescott is comfortable and accounted for. He folded the warrant and put it back in his breast pocket. I'm sure we can allow the territorial magistrate to sort out the paperwork in due time. He looked at Gina. Miss Prescott, he said, I hope your stay in our territory is pleasant. He paused. I'm sure we'll be seeing more of each other. He turned and walked out. The deputy followed. The door closed. Mrs. Aldridge let out a slow breath that she had apparently been holding for some time. Gina took her hand out of her pocket. Harker put his bond paper back in his coat. He looked at Mrs. Aldridge. I apologize for the disruption. Mrs. Aldridge waved it off with a hand. That man has been a disruption to this town for 6 years, she said. She looked at Gina with a directness that felt like reassessment. You're the Prescott girl, the one whose family filed the Copper Ridge claim. Gina looked at her. You know about it. Everyone who pays attention knows about it. She began wrapping the supplies in brown paper, her movements brisk. The assay report on Copper Ridge has been an open secret in this county for 8 months. Blackwood has had surveyors out there twice, on the county's money, claiming it was a road assessment. She glanced up. He can't touch that land as long as the Prescott claim stands. Legal as iron. Which is why he needs me declared incompetent, Gina said. Which is why he needs you declared incompetent, Mrs. Aldridge agreed. She tied the brown paper package. Or dead, though I imagine he'd prefer the paperwork. She said it the way practical women said difficult truths plainly, because the difficulty didn't go away by refusing to name it. Gina nodded. Thank you for saying so. Thank you for staying upright, Mrs. Aldridge said. She looked at Harker. You bring her back in a few weeks. I'll have some things set aside. She said it like an announcement, not an offer. Harker accepted it as such. Much obliged. They loaded the last of the supplies and climbed back onto the wagon bench and moved back down the main street at the same unhurried pace they had come in at. Gina sat straight and looked ahead. She was aware of eyes on them from the boardwalk, from windows, from doorways. Ironwood Town was watching them leave. She did not look back. When they were half a mile out of town, on the open road with the buildings small behind them, she let out a breath. The bond document, she said. Had it 3 weeks, he said. Had it drawn up the day after I found the assay report information in the land registry files. Cal went to Denver for it. You were preparing? I was preparing. She looked at the road ahead. He'll try something else. He will. Harker kept his eyes forward. The warrant was his opening position. He knew it was thin, but he wanted to see how we responded to pressure. Whether you'd come apart or whether I'd fold. He paused. Now he knows we won't, which makes us more dangerous to him. Which makes us more dangerous to him, he confirmed, and which means he'll move to something that isn't theater next time. She thought about Mrs. Aldridge's plain words. Or dead. She turned it over in her mind without flinching from it. She had been flinching from it since the Prairie, telling herself it wasn't that serious, telling herself Clement wanted money, not blood. But blood was what you got when money was large enough, and obstacles were stubborn enough. She understood that now. We need to get to Denver, she said. We need to get to Denver, he agreed. Before he does. Before his paperwork does, Harker said. He'll move to file something with the territorial court, something that puts the incompetence claim in front of a judge before we can challenge it. If that happens, first, if a judge is already looking at the case through Blackwood's framing before we get there to provide our own. He didn't finish the sentence. She finished it herself, silently. If that happens first, the shape of the thing is harder to change. How long do we have? She asked. Riders to Denver take 2 days. The court docket moves slowly. Maybe 2 weeks, maybe 3. He glanced at her. We need a week to prepare. Then we go. 1 week. She organized the timeline in her mind like a set of columns. What needed to happen in that time? Her testimony drafted and organized. The land office records, which Harker's connections might be able to access in advance. The bond documentation expanded. The fraudulent incompetence papers, and the specific legal argument for why her signature on them was invalid. She could do all of that in a week. She had done harder things faster. I'll need paper, she said. Good paper, not ledger sheets and more ink. There's a box of it in the study, he said. Bottom shelf. She hadn't known there was a study. Show me when we get back, I will. The wagon rolled on. The town was gone behind the curve of the land now. Ahead was open prairie, and the long afternoon, and 4 miles to Ironwood Creek. She thought about the third man, the one who had hung back in the doorway of the general store, whom she had not been able to see clearly. She had noticed him as a presence, a shape at the edge of things, watching, not Blackwood's men in the same way the deputy was. Something different about the way he stood. The man in the doorway, she said. Harker's jaw tightened by one small degree. You saw him, she said. I saw him. Who was he? A pause. 3 beats of the horse's hooves on the packed earth. Reed Blackwood, he said. She turned to look at him. His eyes were still on the road. His hands on the reins were even, controlled, giving nothing to the horse that wasn't intentional. But something had changed in his face, a settling in the lines around his mouth, something that had gone deeper than the interaction with the mayor. He was watching, she said. That's what he does, Harker said. He's been watching this ranch for 3 years. He was watching today to see what I'd do, whether I'd back down from his brother or held ground. He paused. And to see you. Why me? He was quiet for a moment. Because you're leveraged now. You became leveraged the moment I brought you to Ironwood Creek. Reed knows that. If he wants to hurt me, and he does, then hurting you is a way to do it. She absorbed that. I'm sorry, she said, that I've brought this to your door. You didn't bring anything, he said immediately. His voice went firm on it. They left you on a prairie in the middle of July with a broken trunk and a sprained ankle. You didn't bring this. They did. He glanced at her briefly, and I brought you here. That was my choice. If there are consequences to it, they're mine to answer for, too. She looked at his profile. The angular jaw, the dust-colored canvas coat, the hands on the rein. It's a lot to take on, she said, for someone you found in a field. People shouldn't be left in fields, he said simply. She turned back to the road. The wind had picked up from the west, pressing against them, and the afternoon light had gone gold and long. Ahead, the Ironwood Creek property line was visible, the fence running north to south, the cattle moving slow and dark in the far pasture. She thought about Reed Blackwood in the doorway, eyes she couldn't quite make out from across the room, watching. She thought about the deputy's hand on his holster and Blackwood's smile that said nothing, and the warrant that wasn't quite legal, but was legal enough to be used. She thought about the derringer in her pocket and the bond document in Harker's coat and the arithmetic workbooks on the wagon bed behind them. She had been left on a prairie with nothing. She had arrived here with nothing. And she was sitting on this wagon bench with a plan and a prepared witness and a working knowledge of territorial bond law and 2 loaded chambers in her pocket, which was considerably more than nothing. Reed Blackwood, she said. Has he ever come onto the ranch property? Not while I've been here. And when you're not here? He glanced at her. She watched him decide something. I'm going to talk to Cal about a night watch rotation, he said. Starting tonight. She nodded. Good. They came through the gate. Scout came out to meet them, tail moving. Tessa was on the porch, had been on the porch. Gina suspected since shortly after they'd left. The girls stood up when the wagon came through and watched them come across the yard with an expression of concentrated relief that she didn't try to hide. Harker set the brake and climbed down and went to the porch and crouched down to Tessa's level. The girl looked at his face and read it. She looked at Gina, who was climbing down from the other side of the wagon. She looked back at her father. He said something to her, low, that Gina didn't catch. Tessa listened to all of it, and then leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his shoulder. For a brief moment, he put his hand on her back. Then she straightened and went to help carry the smaller packages from the wagon, businesslike, as though the moment hadn't happened. Gina carried the arithmetic workbooks inside. She set them on the table and looked at them for a moment. 2 workbooks, 2 spellers, 4 slates, the beginning of something. Not much in material terms. In other terms, in the terms she was beginning to think about and hadn't said aloud, yet it was the start of a different kind of work. Harker came in behind her and saw the workbooks on the table. "Those are for the schooling," he said. It was not quite a question. "Yes." She picked one up and set it down again. "There are children around this property. I've seen them from the fence line rides with Cal, close enough to watch, but not close enough to come in." She looked at him. "Whose children are those?" "Families that work the neighboring spreads, mostly. Some of the native families from the Creek settlement. A few freedmen's families that came out after the war." He leaned against the doorframe. "There's no school that'll take them. Ironwood Town School is." He paused. "It has policies." "I know what policies," she said. He looked at the workbooks. He looked at her. "An oak tree on the east side of the property," she said. "Big one. Good shade. There's flat ground around it." "There is," he said. "I'd like to use it," she said, "if you're agreeable." He was quiet for a moment, not because he was uncertain, she thought, because he was taking the idea seriously enough to look at it from all sides. "I'm agreeable," he said. She put the workbooks on the shelf above the fireplace, where she could see them. She would need to think about how to reach those children, how to communicate to their families that this was safe, that it was real, that it was not a thing that would be taken away. She would figure that out. She was good at figures. Outside, Cal and Eli were carrying the salt and flour to the larder, and the bay horse was being unhitched in the yard, and the long Friday afternoon was tipping toward evening. Inside, Tessa had come back to the table and opened her drawing pages and picked up her pencil and was working on something with her head bent low and her hair falling forward. Gina sat down across from her and opened the ledger to where she had left off. The mayor's smile was still in her mind, his small, pale eyes. The warrant in his breast pocket folded back into place like something he intended to use again. She picked up her pencil. She would be ready when he did. The first child came on a Monday. Gina had spent the better part of 4 days getting ready. She had cleared the ground around the big oak on the east side of the property, raking out the loose stones and leveling what she could with a flat spade she borrowed from the tool shed. She had found 3 old planks in the barn and laid them across short sections of fence post to make benches. She had cut a large piece of dark oilcloth and tacked it between 2 branches. At eye level, a makeshift chalkboard, serviceable, if not elegant. Harker had watched this enterprise without comment, which she had come to understand was his form of approval. If he disagreed with something, he said so. His silence on a matter meant it had his endorsement. Cal had done more. On Thursday evening, without being asked, he had appeared at the oak tree with a proper piece of pine board that he had sanded flat and painted black. He had driven 2 stakes into the ground and mounted the board between them at the right height. "Better than oilcloth," he said. "Much better," Gina agreed. He nodded once and went back to the barn. She had sent word through Eli, who knew the families on the neighboring spreads, and in the Creek settlement, the way you know people you have worked beside for years. She had asked him to pass along a simple message. A school. The oak tree on the east pasture of Ironwood Creek Ranch. Monday morning. All children welcome. No exceptions. She had expected to wait. She had expected to wait several weeks, maybe, for families to decide whether this was safe, whether this woman from Boston was serious, whether the promise of no exceptions was one that would hold when tested. One child came on Monday, a boy, maybe 9, in patched overalls and boots that were 2 sizes too large. He walked up from the direction of the Creek settlement alone, which meant his family had watched him go, but had not come themselves yet. He stopped at the edge of the oak's shade and looked at Gina and the board and the plank benches with an expression of complete neutrality that was clearly a performance of neutrality, behind which was something considerably more interested. "Good morning," Gina said. She did not go to him. She stayed where she was at the board. "I'm Miss Prescott." He looked at the benches, looked at her. "What do we do here?" "We learn things," she said. "Come sit down and I'll show you." He came and sat down. She taught him for 2 hours that morning. Reading, to start. He knew his letters, but not yet how to make them into words with confidence. She worked through a primer page with him, unhurried, correcting gently, and moving on. Then numbers. He was faster with numbers, and the neutrality slipped, and he actually leaned forward over the slate when she showed him a column addition problem that was harder than he expected. He left at midday without saying whether he would come back. He came back Tuesday with a younger sister. By the following Monday, there were 7 children under the oak tree. They came from the Creek settlement, from the 2 neighboring homesteads to the south, from a freedman's family named Porter that had a claim on the far side of the ridge. They ranged from 6 to 11 years old. 2 of them were Arapaho children. From the settlement, a girl named Suki and her brother, who had come the first time with their mother, who had stood at the edge of the pasture, watching for an entire hour before apparently making a decision and going home and sending them again the next day. Tessa came too. She sat at the end of the nearest bench with her slate on her lap, not quite participating, but present. That was enough. Gina did not ask more of her than she was offering. The teaching itself was simple and serious. Gina did not perform it. She did not put on a bright, encouraging voice, or manufacture enthusiasm, or talk to the children as though they were fragile. She spoke to them the way her father had spoken to her, directly, with the assumption that they were capable of understanding things if the things were explained properly. On the 3rd day, a boy named Marcus, one of the Porter children, said to her during a break, "My daddy says colored kids can't learn as good as white kids." He said it flatly, like he was reporting something he had been told and wanted to know what she thought of it. Gina turned from the board and looked at him. She went and knelt on one knee in front of the bench so that her eyes were level with his. She stayed there. "Marcus," she said, "I want you to look at what you did this morning." He waited. "You came here not knowing how to do column subtraction," she said. "You can now do it reliably up to 4 digits. She held up the slate with his work on it. "Who taught you that?" "You did," he said. "I showed you the method," she said. "Your mind learned it. Your mind did that work." She looked at him steadily. "Knowledge does not know skin color, or wealth, or what language your grandmother spoke, or whether you're a boy or a girl. Every child is born with the right to hold their head high and learn. Every single one. Anyone who tells you otherwise is wrong. And I don't say that to be kind to you. I say it because it is factually, provably true." He looked at the slate with his work on it. "Factually," he repeated. "Factually," she confirmed. "Which means it's true whether anyone believes it or not. That's what a fact is." She stood back up. The other children had been listening. Suki was watching her with those serious dark eyes that missed nothing. The boy in the oversized boots, his name was Henry. She had learned had his pencil still in his hand, frozen mid-word, looking at Gina with an expression she couldn't entirely read. She went back to the board and kept teaching. Tessa, at the end of the bench, was looking at Marcus's slate. She turned her own slate over and wrote something on it. She turned it back and looked at what she'd written and erased it and looked out at the pasture. Gina noticed. She said nothing. Harker came by most days at some point during. He did not interrupt. He would appear at the edge of the oak's shade, check that things were in order, and go back to his work. Once she caught him, watching one of the reading lessons from 20 yards off, with an expression that was too composed to be reading as anything, except deliberate composure over something that was moving him. She looked away before he caught her looking. The rope that held the old barn roof support beam had been fraying for months. Gina had noticed it 3 weeks ago and mentioned it to Cal, who had added it to the repair list. It was 3rd on the repair list. The fence gate on the south pasture was 1st, the water pump coupling 2nd, the barn beam rope 3rd. The dust storm came on a Friday, which was the day Cal was working on the south pasture gate. It came from the northwest, the way Colorado storms came in August fast, with almost no warning, the sky going from clear to brown in 20 minutes. Gina was under the oak with the children when the wind shifted and the temperature dropped, and she looked northwest and saw the wall of it coming. She was on her feet before she finished the thought. "Pack your slates," she said. Her voice was calm and quick. "Leave the primers. They'll be here tomorrow." Everyone moved toward the barn now. She had learned, in 5 weeks at Ironwood Creek, to move fast when the land gave you a signal. You did not negotiate with Colorado weather. The children moved. She counted heads as they went, 7 students, plus Tessa. She took Tessa's hand, and they ran with the wind already building behind them. The first gust hitting when they were halfway across the pasture, strong enough to stagger the smaller children. Gina caught Suki's brother by the collar when he stumbled and kept him upright, and they made the barn ahead of the worst of it. She pulled the big barn door shut behind the last child. Inside, dim and dusty, smelling of hay and horse and old timber. The children arranged themselves in the middle of the floor space, several of them pressing close together in the automatic solidarity of shared alarm. Gina counted again. 8. All 8. Then the storm hit the barn with its full weight. The noise was enormous, a sustained roar of wind and flying grit against the timber walls. The barn, shuddering in it, the horses at the far end, stamping and blowing with unease. And underneath the roar, another sound, a creak, high and sharp from overhead. Gina looked up. The beam across the center of the roof, the one held by the fraying rope, was moving. Not much, but it was moving, swaying in the pressure of the storm, and the rope holding it was at its end. She had perhaps 4 seconds to calculate this. Tessa was directly below it. Gina crossed the distance between them, in one movement, not running exactly, more like the decision to move, and the moving were the same thing. And she got her arms around Tessa and turned so her own back was toward the beam, and she put Tessa against her chest, and she bent over her. The rope gave. The beam came down. It hit Gena across the upper back and left shoulder with the flat of it, not the end, not the edge, the flat, which was why she was still standing afterward, though only barely. The impact drove her forward onto her knees, Tessa still enclosed in her arms, both of them on the barn floor. She held still for 1 breath. Then 2. She was not broken, badly hit, her left shoulder sending up a roar of complaint that she set aside to deal with later. Not broken. She loosened her arms. "Tessa," she said, "are you hurt?" Tessa was looking at her. Her face was completely white. Her gray-green eyes were wide and fixed on Gina, with an expression of it was beyond shock. It was past the place where shock lives, in some deeper territory. "Tessa," Gina said again gently, "tell me if you're hurt." The children around them had gone silent. Henry was frozen with his slate still in his hands. Marcus had both fists pressed to his mouth. Suki had her eyes closed. Tessa was looking at Gina's face, and she was not hurt. Gina could see that. She had been completely shielded. But something was happening behind those wide eyes. Something was moving, rising, working its way through 3 years of locked silence like water working through rock. "Miss Gina!" It came out loud, louder than a child Tessa's size should have been able to produce. Sharp and clear, and cracked down the middle, with fear and relief in equal measure. The barn held it for a moment. The sound of it. Then the storm outside, which had no opinion about the matter, kept going. Gina looked at Tessa. Tessa was still looking at her. They were both on their knees on the barn floor, and Tessa had both her small hands wrapped around Gina's forearm, and her eyes were bright and spilling over, and the name Miss Gina was still hanging in the air between them. "I'm here," Gina said. Her voice was steady. She worked to keep it steady. "I'm right here. I'm not hurt." She was somewhat hurt. She set that aside. She put her right hand over Tessa's hands on her arm and held them. "You spoke," Gina said quietly. "Just the 2 of them in it, even though the other children were right there." "Tessa, you spoke!" Tessa blinked. A tear ran down her left cheek, and she did not wipe it. She was looking at Gina like someone who has just heard their own voice for the first time. In so long, they had forgotten the sound of it. The storm outside ran another 20 minutes, and then diminished, and then stopped. the way August storms did absolutely, as though they had never existed. When Harker opened the barn door, the first thing he saw was Gina on her knees, on the floor, with Tessa's hands in hers, and the broken beam behind them and all 8 children arranged in a silent circle. He took in the beam. He looked at Gina's left shoulder, where the impact had pulled the dress fabric sideways. His face went through something in about 2 seconds that he then locked down completely. He crossed the barn in 4 steps and crouched in front of Tessa. She looked at him. Papa. It was barely a word, more a breath with a shape, but it was there. Harker's locked-down expression did not survive that. He pulled Tessa into his arms and held her with both hands pressed flat against her back, and he stayed there on his knees on the barn floor, and he held his daughter who had just spoken her second word in 3 years. And Gina looked away and gave him that. She stood up slowly, her left shoulder, protesting at length about the experience. Henry was at her elbow. "You okay, Miss Prescott?" he said. "I'm going to be fine," she said. "Thank you for asking." Marcus was looking at the fallen beam. "That would have hit her," he said, meaning Tessa, and his voice was flat with the retrospective weight of it. "It would have," Gina agreed. She looked at the beam, and it didn't. "Because you moved," Henry said. She looked at him. He was watching her with that expression she had seen before and couldn't quite name. It was closer now. It was something like recognition, the look of someone who has just seen a thing they will keep. "You learn things," she said, "and then when something happens, the learning is already in you. It doesn't feel like a decision. It just feels like moving." She looked at the other children. "That's why we come to school. Not so we can answer questions on a page. So we have more to draw on when it matters." Suki looked at her steadily. "You could have gotten hurt," she said. It was the most Suki had said at one time, in all the weeks of school. "Yes," Gina said simply. "That was a possibility I considered in about half a second, and it didn't change anything." She meant it. That surprised her slightly how completely she meant it. Harker stood up with Tessa's hand in his. He looked at Gina. There was nothing neutral in his expression now. There was nothing composed or managed or set aside. He looked at her with everything she had just done, still visible in his eyes, and it was a complete and unguarded look. And she felt it. "Can you ride?" he said. His voice was even, very deliberately even. "I don't need a doctor," she said. "Can you ride?" he said again. She thought about her shoulder. She thought about being honest. "Probably not today," she admitted. "Then Cal will take the children home, and I'll drive you back to the house in the wagon." He turned to the children. "Everyone safe?" 7 heads nodded. "Good." He looked at each of them, a brief straight-on look, each child in turn. "You did well, staying together, and staying calm." He looked at Henry. "You held the door?" "Yes, sir," Henry said. Distinct. He held Henry's gaze for a second. "Your mother know you come here?" Henry's chin went up slightly. "Yes, sir. She's the one who told me to." Something moved in Harker's expression. "Tell her thank you for that." Cal arrived from outside, took in the situation with his usual economy of reaction, and began organizing the children's return with a practical efficiency that Gina appreciated from her current position of sitting on a hay bale. Eli came with him, and they sorted out who went with whom and which direction. And within 15 minutes, the children were moving off in the appropriate directions, Suki looking back once from the pasture edge. Harker drove the wagon close to the barn door. He did not offer to lift Gina onto the seat. He climbed up himself, set the brake, and climbed back down and stood beside the wagon. "I can get myself up," she said. "I know you can," he said. "I'm standing here in case you find you can't." She gripped the side of the wagon with her right hand and stepped up and found that she could, barely, and he did not assist, but he did not step back either, staying close enough that if she had needed him, he was there. She settled onto the seat and let out a controlled breath. He climbed up on his side and released the brake. They crossed the yard. Tessa was already on the porch, sitting on the step where she always sat. She watched them come with her hands in her lap. He stopped the wagon and got down and came around to Gina's side. "I can," she began. "Miss Prescott," he said. He was looking up at her. "You took a barn beam across your back to cover my daughter." His voice was doing what voices do when the feelings behind them are large enough to create pressure. "Please allow me to help you down from this wagon." She looked at him. She put her right hand in his and stepped down. He kept hold of her hand a moment longer than the mechanics of the situation required. Not much longer. A breath's worth. Then he let go. Inside, Tessa was already at the kitchen table. She had a cup of water, and she was sitting straight, and she was watching the door. When Gina came in and sat across from her, she looked at her with those clear gray-green eyes and said, "Does it hurt?" Her voice was rough with disuse. It cracked on the last word, but it was there. Gina looked at her. "Yes," she said, "a bit." Tessa nodded seriously. "But not badly," Gina added. Tessa nodded again. Harker came in behind them and went to the shelf where he kept a small medical kit. He set it on the table and looked at Gina. "May I?" he said. He gestured at her left shoulder. "Yes," she said. He examined it carefully. His hands were light, and sure, he had done this before. She could tell by the way. He pressed and assessed without hesitation. Field medicine, probably. She imagined a cavalry scout, learned it from necessity. "Not broken," he said. "Badly bruised." He wrapped it with a linen bandage, support rather than immobilization, and tied it off. "Keep it still tonight. I have ledger work," she said. He looked at her. "Right hand," she said. "The left one just holds the page." He held her gaze for a moment and then went and poured 2 cups of coffee and brought them back and sat down at the table. Tessa was still there. She had not moved to her usual drawing position at the end of the table. She was sitting at the center between them, and she was watching them both with the alert attentiveness she brought to everything. "Tessa," Harker said. She looked at him. "How does it feel?" he said. "To talk." She thought about this with the seriousness she brought to all things. She wrapped both hands around her water cup. "Strange," she said. Her voice was still rough, still finding itself, like my mouth forgot. "It'll remember," he said. She considered that. "Will it sound right again?" "It sounds right now," he said. She looked at Gina. "It sounds exactly right," Gina said. Tessa turned her water cup in her hands. She looked at the table. Then she looked up at Gina. "Why did you come to our ranch?" she said. Gina looked at her. The question was direct and without guile and required a direct answer. "Because your father found me alone on the prairie and brought me somewhere safe," she said. "And because I had nowhere else to go, and because when I got here, it turned out to be a place worth staying." Tessa looked at her for a long time. "I'm glad you stayed," she said. Harker looked at his coffee cup. Gina looked at hers. "I'm glad too," she said. That evening, after Tessa had gone to bed, she had talked a little more over dinner, haltingly, finding words like a person relearning a path through familiar country. Gina sat at the long table with the ledger, and her right hand working the pencil, and her left arm held relatively still. Harker sat across from her with his own papers, as had become their habit. The fire was going in the hearth. The lamp between them made a warm pool of light. After a long quiet, he said, "She called you Miss Gina." "She did," Gina said. "That's what the children at school call you. It's what they've settled on." She kept her pencil moving. "I don't mind it." He was quiet again. "Then she hasn't spoken since she was 4 to anyone." He paused. "She was trying to. I could see it sometimes." The trying. Another pause. It just wouldn't come. Gina set her pencil down and looked at him. "It came today," she said. "It came today," he said, "because you threw yourself in front of a barn beam. Because she was frightened enough that the words got out before the silence could stop them," Gina said. "That's not because of me, specifically. That's because a crisis reached something that had been locked away." She met his eyes. She would have found her way back regardless. He looked at her with that unguarded look again. She was getting less unprepared for it, but it still had weight. "You don't want the credit," he said. "I want the accurate version," she said. "It's a habit." A corner of his mouth shifted. She had learned to watch for that. "The children," he said, "today, the way they listen to you. They listen because I don't talk down to them," she said. "Nobody listens when they're being talked down to. They just stop hearing. What you said to the Porter boy," he said, "about knowledge not caring what color you are." She looked at him. "I didn't teach it as sentiment," she said. "I taught it as a fact. Because it is one. Any evidence to the contrary is evidence of what people have done to other people, not evidence of what's true about capacity." She picked up her pencil. "Marcus did 4-digit subtraction today correctly on the first try. That is data. It supersedes someone's opinion about what he can and cannot learn." Harker looked at her for a long moment. "When this is over," he said, "the court case, Denver, all of it, What do you want to do? It was a question she had not let herself fully ask. Not yet. There was too much between here and the answer. She thought about the slates under the oak tree. She thought about Marcus leaning forward over a hard problem. She thought about Suki finally speaking to her today in the barn. She thought about Tessa saying strange, and my mouth forgot, and I'm glad you stayed. Keep the school, she said. Make it real. A building eventually, not an oak tree, but the oak tree first. She paused. And finish fixing your accounts. They're about 80% sorted, but the cattle sale records from last fall still have the error in them. He almost smiled. All the way to a smile, this time brief but complete. Of course they do, he said. She turned back to the ledger. Outside, the night was clear after the storm, the stars extraordinary in their density and brightness. Somewhere, in the creek settlement, Suki's mother was hearing about today. In the Porter homestead, Marcus was probably telling his father what Miss Prescott had said, and his father was probably sitting with that for a while. In the bunkhouse, Cal was probably already asleep, and in this room, in the lamp's pool of light, Gina worked her pencil across the columns, and Harker read his papers, and the fire held its warmth between them, and on the floor above their heads, Tessa Vane was sleeping. After having spoken her first real words in 3 years, and all of it was fragile and real at once, Gina kept working. She had the feeling, clear and specific, that this was the shape of something worth protecting. The smell came first. Gina was at the table, working by lamplight when it reached her faint, carried on the night air through the gap she'd left in the kitchen window. She paused with her pencil over the ledger. Smoke. Not the comfortable, close smoke of the hearth, which she knew by now in her bones. Something different, something that came from a distance and had size to it. She went to the window and looked out. The south pasture was burning. Not the whole, not yet, but the glow was visible from here, orange against the black, maybe half a mile down the fence line, and it was moving. The wind was from the southwest tonight, which meant it was moving toward the cattle pens. She was out the front door before she finished thinking it through. Harker was already in the yard. He had seen it from the bunkhouse window. She realized he crossed from that direction at a run, still pulling on his coat, and Cal was behind him, and Eli behind Cal and Moss coming from the far side of the barn. He stopped when he saw her on the porch. "Get back inside," he said, not a request, not a negotiation. The voice he used when seconds mattered. "How bad is it?" she said, "South pasture." Brush fire, wind-driven. He was already moving toward the barn. "We need water wagons, and every hand on the line. It gets to the cattle pens, and we lose the winter herd." He looked back at her, Gina. It was the first time he had used her name without the miss. She noticed it. "Inside," he said. "Lock the doors. Keep Tessa upstairs." "She's asleep," Gina said. "Keep her that way." He held her gaze for 1 second. "I'll be back as soon as it's controlled." Then he was gone. The 4 of them rode out Harker on the bay, the others in the water wagon, and the night took them, and the glow on the horizon went on burning. Gina went back inside. She bolted the front door. She went to the kitchen door and bolted that too. She stood in the center of the main room and looked at the fireplace and thought. She thought about Harker's calculation. Fire at the south pasture, threatening the cattle pens. Every hand required. All 4 of them riding out at once, leaving the ranch house with 1 woman and 1 child. She thought about what she knew of Orson Blackwood and his methods. Theater, Harker had said, back on that trip to town. He had also said that after the theater came something that wasn't theater. She went upstairs. Tessa's door was slightly open, the way she kept it. Gina pushed it further and looked in. The girl was in her bed, asleep, 1 arm across the quilt. Her breathing was slow and regular. Gina went back to the hallway. She retrieved the Derringer from her room and checked both chambers. Loaded. She put it in her dress pocket. Then she went back downstairs and turned down all but 1 lamp and sat in the chair nearest the fireplace with a clear line of sight to both the front door and the kitchen. And she waited. She was not certain. She could be wrong. The fire could simply be a fire, accidental, started by a dry summer and an ill-placed spark, and Harker would come back in 2 hours smelling of smoke, and she would feel foolish for sitting in the dark with a pistol in her pocket. She could be wrong. She sat very still and listened to the house. 15 minutes passed. 20. The glow through the south window was steady, not growing. That was something the water wagons had reached it. Probably they were holding the line. At 30 minutes, she heard something that was not the house. A horse, moving slowly, then stopping, then nothing. She stayed in the chair and did not move. The kitchen window, the one she had left open earlier, the one the smoke smell had come through. She had closed it when she bolted the door. She was certain she had closed it. The latch moved. It was a small sound, almost nothing. But the latch moved, and then the window swung open slowly from outside, and the night air came in, and then a man came through it. He was not enormous. That was the first thing she registered, which seemed odd afterward, because the effect of him in the room was enormous. Medium height, lean, moving with the particular fluency of a person who spent time in places they were not supposed to be. Dark coat, dark hat, pushed back. A face she had glimpsed once before, in the doorway of a general store angular, with the family resemblance to the mayor, that she now recognized clearly. Reed Blackwood stood in her kitchen and looked at her sitting in the chair by the fire, and his expression did not change at all. She did not reach for the derringer, not yet. Her hand was near it. She left it near. "Miss Prescott," he said. His voice was low and even, which was somehow worse than loud. "You've made yourself right at home." She looked at him without moving. Mr. Blackwood. Something shifted in his face. Not surprise, he had known she recognized him. Reassessment, maybe. A revision of what he was dealing with. "Where's Vane?" he said. "South pasture," she said, "as you know." He looked at her for a moment. Then he almost smiled, which was not a reassuring thing to see. "Smart woman. I'd like you to leave my kitchen," she said. "Your kitchen?" He looked around it with a deliberate slowness. "Funny. I don't see your name on anything." He moved toward the main room. She tracked him from the chair, turning in it. He stopped in the center of the room and looked at the mantel, at the photograph there. The dark-haired woman, with the composed expression. He looked at it for a long time. "My sister," he said. His voice went different when he said it. The evenness cracked slightly, just at the edges. She deserved better than this place, better than him. He looked at the photograph. She married him because she loved him, and he took her out to this godforsaken. He stopped, collected himself. He rode ahead. "Did you know that? Cavalryman. Supposed to be the best scout in the territory. Rode ahead and left her in the wagon with a 4-year-old child." Gina said nothing. "He'll tell you he didn't know," Reed said. "He'll tell you he couldn't have predicted it. He'll tell you it wasn't his fault, and he's believed that long enough that it sounds true when he says it." He turned from the photograph. "But my sister is in the ground, and he's still here. Building schools, playing the good man." His voice had gone quiet on that last part, quiet in a way that had pressure behind it. "Grief does not entitle you to what you came here to do tonight," Gina said. He looked at her. She met his eyes. "You lost someone you loved. That is real, and it is terrible, and I don't dismiss it." She kept her voice level. "But what you're doing with it, what you've built with it, this alliance with your brother, this plan that is not grief anymore, that is choice. And you know the difference." He stared at her. The kitchen window was still open behind him. The distant glow of the fire was still visible through the south window. Then he moved, not toward her. He went to the window that faced south and looked out at the fire's glow, and his face went cold and focused, and all the grief and the justified anger went somewhere, behind his eyes where they could not be reached. "The fire was my brother's idea," he said. "Draw Vane out. Clear the house." He was talking more than he should, she registered. There was something loose in him tonight, something that had been held long and had given way. "Orson doesn't care about my sister. He cares about the silver. He needed someone who could get through Vane's defenses, and I was convenient." He turned from the window. "He wants the land. He wants you removed as the legal heir. He wants this," he gestured at the house, at the ranch, at all of it gone. "And what do you want?" Gina said. The silence lasted several seconds. "I want Vane to pay for what happened," he said. "Then you want something that isn't possible," she said. "You cannot make him pay for a grief that belongs to everyone who loved her. It doesn't work that way." His jaw tightened. "You need to leave," she said, "before this goes further than it can come back from." For one moment she thought he might. He didn't. He crossed the room toward the stairs. Gina was out of the chair. "Tessa is up those stairs," she said. He stopped. "She's 7 years old," Gina said. Her voice was different now, Something had left it that was not coming back. She has spent 3 years without a voice because of what happened on that road. She spoke for the first time this week. She was between him and the stairs. You are not going near those stairs. He looked at her. He looked at the stairs. He looked back at her. I wasn't going to hurt the child, he said. Then what were you going up there for? A beat. There's a root cellar, he said. Trapdoor in the back bedroom. I know this ranch. I grew up visiting it when a different family owned it. He met her eyes, and there was something in his that she could not resolve. I was going to put you down there and take the girl out and burn the house. The words were so flat and deliberate that for a moment they didn't land. Then they did. She reached into her pocket. She had the derringer in her hand, and it was leveled before he fully processed that she had moved. 2 steps backward put her directly at the foot of the stairs, her back to the first step, the gun up, and pointed at his chest. He went very still. You've been practicing, he said. Every few days for 6 weeks, she said. Step back. He stepped back. Toward the kitchen, she said. He moved backward slowly, his eyes on the gun. She tracked him. Miss Prescott, he said. His voice was almost conversational. You're not going to shoot me. I'm going to keep you in this room until Mr. Vane returns, she said. Whether that requires shooting you is your decision, not mine. Something crossed his face. She wasn't going to call it admiration. She was going to call it a revised estimate. She heard it before she saw it, a sound from outside, around the west side of the house. Another sound joining the first. 2 of them. Reed's men. She had known there would be more. She had known, and she had calculated that the Derringer had 2 shots and she had 2 problems, and those numbers matched in a way that was not comforting. The front door took 1 hard kick, and the bolt held. The second kick broke it. 2 men came through. One she didn't know. The other she recognized as a man she had seen in Ironwood Town, one of the shapes that had hung at the periphery of Blackwood's group. The situation had changed. She did not lower the gun. Reed looked at the 2 men behind her. He looked at her. She was at the foot of the stairs with the gun still up, and now 3 of them in the room and only 2 shots, and she ran the arithmetic in the time it took to breathe. Take her, Reed said. She fired. The shot hit the lamp on the table. It was not what she had aimed at. What she had aimed at was the man moving toward her on the left, and she had missed, and the lamp shattered, and the oil caught, and the table was burning in a second, and the room went chaos. She took the stairs 2 at a time. She did not think about the second shot. She had one, and she needed it to mean something. Tessa's door. She hit it with both hands and got inside and closed it behind her and shoved the wooden chair under the handle and went to Tessa's bed and shook her by the shoulder. Tessa, wake up right now. Tessa came up from sleep fast. The way children do when the person waking them is serious. She looked at Gina's face and went immediately, completely alert. No crying, no confusion. She read the situation in Gina's expression and waited. We're going out the window, Gina said. Can you climb down the porch roof? Tessa nodded. Good girl. Gina got the window open. Below the window was the porch roof, maybe a 4-foot drop, and from the porch roof it was another 6 or 7 feet to the ground. Manageable. Go first. I'll be right behind you. Tessa went out the window with a composure that was remarkable in a 7-year-old. Gina heard her land on the porch roof, heard her move across it. Then she heard the men on the stairs. She went out the window. The porch roof was steep enough to be awkward. She slid more than climbed down to the edge and dropped to the ground, and her left shoulder screamed at the impact, and she bit down on it and grabbed Tessa's hand, and they ran. The root cellar. She remembered it. Now Reed had mentioned it. A trapdoor in the back bedroom that he had been moving toward, which meant it was accessible from outside as well as inside. And outside meant under the back of the house, which meant she found the exterior door in the ground behind the house. A flat wooden hatch, iron handle, padlocked. She looked at the padlock, looked at Tessa, looked at the house where the downstairs light had gone wrong, and she could smell the fire from the kitchen table taking hold. She had the second shot in the Derringer. She shot the padlock. It didn't break open the way. Padlocks broke open in stories. It deformed. The shackle bent, and she hit it twice with the heel of her hand, and it gave, and she got the hatch up and the darkness of the cellar below. Down, she told Tessa. There are steps. I'll be right behind you. Tessa went down without a word. Gina went down after her and pulled the hatch closed above them. The root cellar was about 8 feet square, smelling of dirt and old potatoes and cool stone. She could not see anything. She felt along the wall until she found Tessa and put her arm around her, and they sat against the far wall in the dark. Above them, through the earth and the hatch, she could hear the sounds of the house. Shouting, movement, the crack and rush of the fire getting into the walls. She held Tessa close, and the girl did not shake. She held very still, and her breathing was controlled. And Gina thought, not for the first time, that this was one of the toughest children she had ever encountered. "It's all right," Gina said quietly. Tessa didn't answer. She put her head against Gina's good shoulder and stayed there. Gina kept count of time, the way she kept count of everything, systematically marking it in her mind. 5 minutes. 10. The sounds above had changed. Less shouting, more of something else. Something she could hear even through the earth. Fire. She pressed her palm flat against the underside of the hatch and felt it. Not hot, not yet. But the smoke was coming through the edge gaps, thin threads of it, and she could smell it clearly now. Tessa coughed once, softly. Gina thought about the hatch. She thought about whether she should open it and run for it, or whether opening it would bring someone down here. She thought about which was the greater risk. She did not know where Reed was. That was the problem. She did not know if his men were still in the house, or if they had cleared out once the fire took. She did not know if they knew about the root cellar entrance from outside. She thought about the strip of petticoat she had torn from her dress when climbing out the window. It had snagged on the latch, and she had not pulled it free, had not had the hand to pull it free, grabbing Tessa instead. Good. It was there on the outside of the house, at the window, a marker. She felt along the hem of her dress, in the dark, found a seam, pulled. The fabric tore quietly. She tore 2 more strips and felt for the gap at the edge of the hatch door and pushed the fabric through so the ends hung outside. If he came looking, if he followed the trail, there would be something to follow. Above them, the fire worked through the house with the patience that large things have, and the smoke thickened slowly in the root cellar. And Tessa did not speak, but she did not shake. And Gina held her and counted time and thought about Harker riding back toward the glow of a fire that had moved. She hoped he would realize it had moved. She was trusting him to realize it had moved. He came back. She heard the horse first, then more horses, then Harker's voice, not words, just the shape of it, urgent calling. She heard him calling her name, and it cut through everything else, through the smoke and the darkness and the sound of the burning house. She got the hatch up. The night air came down into the cellar, and she filled her lungs with it. She handed Tessa up first. Tessa came up through the hatch into Harker's arms, and Gina heard the sound he made when he had her, not words, just the released breath of a man who has been holding something terrible at arm's length and can finally let it go. Then his hand came down through the hatch, and Gina took it and came up. The house was burning. The back wall was fully involved, the fire orange and enormous against the night sky, throwing heat in waves across the yard. The front sections was still standing, barely. The south window had blown out. Reed Blackwood and his men were gone. Harker had Tessa in one arm, and his other hand still holding Gina's. He looked at her the same look as after the barn beam, but larger, and with something underneath it that wasn't going back behind the careful composure he usually kept. "You got her to the cellar," he said. "She got herself there," Gina said. "I just showed her the hatch." Tessa, pressed against her father's chest, turned her head to look at Gina. "You showed me the hatch," she said, her rough new voice coming out firm, "and you shot the lock." Harker looked at her. He looked at Gina. Cal and Eli and Moss were behind him. She could see them now, the shapes of them in the firelight, standing back. Their faces were dark with smoke and something else. Cal looked at the burning house. He looked at Gina. "Both barrels," she said. He nodded once. "Practical," he said. Harker released her hand and moved to direct the water from the wagon at the part of the house that could still be saved, and Moss and Eli went with him, and the work of it took over. Gina stood in the yard with her empty derringer in her hand and watched the east wing burn and the west wing hold, and the men work the water lines. When they had it contained, the east half gone, the west half standing, the fire reduced to a gasping, ugly remnant of itself. Harker came back to where she was standing. He stood beside her. They both looked at the damage. He bent down and picked something up from the mud. She had not noticed it fall. She had not noticed the moment it had come off her neck. He held it out to her. Her mother's silver locket, the chain broken, the case dented on one side, mud on it, and something dark that was not mud. He looked at the blood on the locket, and his face went to a place she had not seen before. Past the anger he usually controlled, past the composure, past all of it. He dropped to his knees in the mud and ash. "Gina," he said. It was barely sound. It was her name in his throat when there was nothing left to manage. "I'm here," she said. She was standing right beside him. "Harker, I'm right here." He looked up at her. The fire behind them had gone to embers, and the smoke rose straight in the still air, and the sky above it was the same enormous star-filled sky it always was, indifferent and beautiful. He pressed the locket into her hand. She closed her fingers around it. The blood was from the climb out the window. She had caught her hand on the latch. She was aware of that now, the cut on her palm. Small, manageable. She had not noticed it until this moment. "He was here," Harker said, still on his knees. "Reed was in this house." He was. What did he say? She looked at the locket in her hand. "He said, your brother-in-law and my uncle want the silver," she said, "and that he's been carrying his grief as a weapon for 3 years. She paused, "and that he wasn't going to hurt Tessa." Harker looked at her. "I don't know if that's true," she said. "I'm telling you what he said." He was quiet for a long time. The embers popped. An owl called somewhere out on the dark prairie, far away. "He set this fire," Harker said. "His brother's plan?" she said. "He told me that too. I believe him on that part. Whether it was his idea or Orson's, he carried it out." "Yes," she said. "He did." Harker stood up. He looked at the burned half of his house. He looked at Tessa, who was sitting on the porch of the surviving west section, with Cal's coat around her, watching them. "We're going to Denver," he said. "Not in a week. We're going now." "Agreed," Gina said. He looked at her. "Are you hurt?" "My hand," she said. The latch. He took her hand carefully, palm up, and looked at the cut in the firelight. He held her hand in both of his and looked at it for a moment, and then pressed his handkerchief against it without letting go. "We pack tonight," he said. "We ride at first light." She nodded. He looked at the broken locket in her closed fist. "Your mother's," he said. "Yes, we'll get it repaired in Denver." She looked at the locket, at the bent case and the broken chain, the small damage that stood for all the larger damages of the last months. "Yes," she said, "we will." The night held them both in the mud and ash and firelight, and the surviving west wing stood solid behind them. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the pasture, Reed Blackwood was riding away with 3 years of grief, and a failed plan, and the morning was coming, and Denver was 2 days' ride north. She closed her hand around the locket. She was ready. The first thing Harker did at dawn was not grieve. That came later, in its own time, and would last its own length. He knew that about grief had learned it 3 years ago when it had ambushed him on a road east of Pueblo, proving that even the best scout can miss what's right in front of him. Grief had its season. This was not that season. This was the season for thinking clearly. He stood in the gray pre-dawn light, in front of what remained of the east wing, and he looked at it systematically, the way he had once looked at contested ground before a cavalry engagement. What was destroyed? What was salvageable? What information the wreckage contained? He had his hat in his hands, and his jaw was set, and his eyes moved across the burn pattern the way they had once moved across a battlefield, reading it, extracting from it what it had to tell. Cal stood beside him. "East wing is total loss," Cal said. He always led with the hard fact. Harker had been grateful for that quality in him for 4 years. "Roof's gone, 2 walls gone, floors compromised. West wing is sound. Smoke damage, some heat warping on the interior walls on the east side, but the structure held. The barn? Untouched. Livestock are all counted." He paused. Fire started on the kitchen table. Went up the east wall from there. Harker looked at the kitchen, or where the kitchen had been. He thought about Gina at that table every morning, her pencil moving across the ledger pages, her coffee going cold beside her, because she forgot it when she was working. He thought about Tessa at the end of the table with her drawing papers. He put his hat back on. "We need trackers," he said. Reed came in from somewhere and rode out somewhere. "I want to know which direction." Cal nodded. "Eli knows the Creek settlement families. The Arapaho men out there read trail better than anyone I've seen. Get them, Harker said. Today. And I need the Porters and any other families from Gina's school who have men who are willing. He looked at Cal. This isn't their fight. Make that clear. I'm asking for help, not claiming it. Understood, Cal said. Gina came out of the surviving wing's front door at that moment, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She had slept briefly in the intact upstairs room, and her hair was pinned back practically, and she had the look of someone who had processed the previous night and arrived at the next set of tasks. The cut on her palm was bandaged with a clean strip of linen. She handed him a cup. What's the plan, he told her. She listened with both hands around her own cup, looking at the burned section of the house. When he finished, she said, I can help with the trail. Not the tracking itself, but the evidence gathering. I left markers. He looked at her. Strips of petticoat, she said, on the window latch when we came out. At the root cellar hatch, I tore more pieces and pushed them through the gap in the hatch cover while we were waiting. She met his eyes evenly. I didn't know if you'd come looking from the right direction, so I left what I could. Cal, behind Harker, made a sound that was not quite a word. It was the sound of a man revising his estimate of someone upward considerably. Harker looked at her for a moment. Show me, he said. She walked him around the exterior of the house, pointing as she went. The strip on the window latch was still there, pale against the scorched frame. A second strip had blown 3 feet from the root cellar hatch, but was caught on a grass clump nearby. The fabric she had pushed through the gap was still there, ends trailing out like a flag. She had also, he saw, done something else. Along the path from the back of the house to the root cellar, small items were placed at intervals: a button, a piece of pencil lead, a twist of paper. He had not asked her about those. When did you do that? He said. While we were running to the cellar, she said. He looked at the button in the dirt. Small, dark, ordinary. The kind of thing no one would notice. You were running in the dark with Tessa, he said, and you were dropping markers. I didn't know how long we'd be down there, she said simply. I was trying to give you something to find. He looked at her. He looked at the markers. He picked up the button and held it in his palm for a moment and then gave it back to her. You did well, he said. She put the button in her pocket. I did what the situation required. That's usually what doing well means, he said. The Arapaho trackers arrived by mid-morning. 2 men from the Creek settlement, both of whom Gina recognized fathers of her students. One was Suki's father, a broad-shouldered man named Gray Horse, who communicated through Eli and spoke in the careful, deliberate way of someone choosing words in a second language. The other was younger, maybe 25, and moved through the yard with a quality of attention that was like watching someone listen to something everyone else couldn't hear. Gray Horse walked the perimeter of the house without speaking for a full 10 minutes. He stopped at the kitchen window. He crouched and examined the ground. He looked at the route from the window to the south pasture fence and back. Then he went to Harker and spoke, and Eli translated. 4 horses tied at the south fence line, about 100 yards east of the gate. Left in a hurry. 2 men went into the house through the window. One stayed with the horses. One came around the front. He paused for Eli to catch up. All 4 rode out northwest, toward Devil's Canyon. Harker knew Devil's Canyon, 15 miles northwest, into the higher terrain where the land got complicated, and a man who knew the rock formations could disappear effectively. Reed knows that country, Cal said. He does, Harker agreed. His father took him up there every hunting season. Gray Horse spoke again. Eli said, he says there's something else. The horses left signs heading northwest, but one rider separated before the canyon, went northeast instead. Toward town, Harker said. Toward town, Eli confirmed. Orson Blackwood's man. Reporting back, probably. Reporting that the house had burned, but Gina was not accounted for, that things had not gone as planned, that Harker was not destroyed, and the heir was not dead, and the situation needed revision. Gina was standing slightly behind Harker, listening to all of this. He turned to look at her. Blackwood will know by this afternoon that last night failed, he said. Then we have until this afternoon before he does something else, she said. We may have less. He looked at Gray Horse and Eli. Ask him if he'll ride with us to track them to the canyon, Eli asked. Gray Horse responded. Eli said, he says his daughter goes to Miss Prescott's school. He will ride. The younger man added something without waiting for translation. Eli smiled slightly. He says his daughter reads better than his son now, and he would like to know where the school is going to be, now that the ranch has a problem. Gina looked at the younger man. Tell him the school will continue. The oak tree is still standing. Eli translated. The younger man looked at Gina for a moment and then nodded once. Something settled in his expression. The Porter family arrived at noon. Isaac Porter came himself, a large, deliberate man with a steady gaze and two of his older sons behind him. He had heard about the fire through the network of people that small rural communities run on, news moving faster than horses sometimes, and he had not waited for an invitation. He looked at the burned wing, and he looked at Harker. My boy Marcus tells me, you've got trouble with Blackwood, he said. He said it directly. The way he apparently did everything. I've had trouble with Blackwood for 2 years. He's been trying to reclassify my land title as abandoned property so he can claim it for the county. I saw the registry filing. Isaac looked at him. You saw it, and you didn't tell me. I was going to tell you in Denver, Harker said, when we had the territorial court moving on it. I didn't want to put you in the middle of it before we had legal standing. Isaac was quiet for a moment. Then he said, you should have told me. You're right, Harker said. I should have. Another moment of quiet. What do you need, Isaac? Harker told him. Isaac glanced at him. He looked at his sons. We can ride, he said. Gina stepped forward. Mr. Porter. Thank you. He looked at her. My boy says you told him knowledge is a fact, not an opinion. He paused. He's been saying that at dinner for 2 weeks, correcting everyone. Something in his face shifted slightly. I appreciate that particular correction. She held his gaze. It's the truth, and he's the one who understood it. Isaac Porter looked at her for another moment. Then he looked at the oak tree on the east pasture, still standing, unchanged by the night's events. School better be open by Monday, he said. It will be, she said. Tessa had been quiet all morning. Not the old silence, not the locked, impenetrable stillness that had lasted 3 years. This was different. This was the quiet of someone thinking, someone processing, someone sorting through a large amount of material, and taking the time to do it right. She stayed close to Gina while the men organized, and the tracking plan took shape. She sat on the fence rail near where Gina was standing and watched everything with those clear, gray-green eyes, absorbing it all. Mid-morning, she said, I can help. Harker, who was going over the route to Devil's Canyon with Gray Horse and Cal, looked at his daughter. With what? He said. He did not say, you're too young or stay out of it. He asked what she meant. Tessa climbed down from the fence rail. She went to the edge of the burned section of the house and stood looking at the ground. Then she looked back at her father. I went to the window, she said. Her voice was still rough with disuse, but steadier than it had been. When I heard the men come in last night, before Miss Gina woke me up, I looked out. Everyone was quiet. I saw the horses, she said, at the fence. Harker came to her. He crouched down to her level. What did you see? 4 horses, she said. One of them was gray, not dark gray, light gray, almost white, with a dark mark on its face. She demonstrated with her finger, drawing a diagonal across her own cheek. I don't know what that's called. Gray Horse, who had come to listen, spoke. Eli translated. He says that's called a blaze. And he says there's only one horse like that in this county that he knows of. It belongs to the Blackwood outfit. Reed Blackwood rides it himself sometimes. Tessa looked at Gray Horse. She said carefully. Was that helpful? He looked at her seriously. He said something to Eli, Eli said. He says it confirms the northwest direction. Reed himself was here. Tessa absorbed that. She looked at her father. He looked back at her with the expression she had seen twice now, the one that had no management in it at all. That was very helpful, he said. She nodded. Then she looked at Gina. Then she did something that surprised everyone, including apparently herself. She raised her right hand and pointed at the ground just inside the fence line, below where she said she'd been standing at the window. There was something there. Harker went and looked. He picked it up and held it toward the light. A button. Dark metal, distinctive shape, a 6-pointed star pressed into the face. The kind of button that came from a specific coat, not a working man's coat, something more considered. Cal looked at it. That's a military button, he said. Not standard issue. Officer's button, custom made. I've seen that pattern. Harker turned it in his fingers. Reed Blackwood was commissioned out of Fort Lyon in '64, Cal said. Captain, those were his buttons. Harker closed his fist around it. Tessa looked at her pointing hand and then put it down. She had the expression of someone who has just discovered that paying attention has direct and practical consequences, and who found this discovery significant. Good eye, Gina said to her. Tessa looked at her. You taught us to look at things carefully, she said. At school, you said observation is the beginning of everything. Gina went still. I said that last week, she said, during the reading lesson. I was listening, Tessa said. A long beat of quiet. Then Harker stood and looked at his assembled group, Gray Horse, and the young tracker, Cal and Eli and Moss, Isaac Porter, and his 2 sons. 8 men, plus the information that Tessa had provided, and the trail markers that Gina had laid. Northwest, he said. We move in an hour. Weapons loaded, extra ammunition. We're not going for a fight, if we can help it. He looked at each of them in turn. We're going to find them, confirm their position, and hold until we can get word to the Territorial Marshal's office. He paused. Anyone who's coming is coming by their own choice and can turn back at the canyon entrance without any word from me. This is my problem that spilled onto your properties and your families. I'm grateful for the help, and I won't ask for more than you're willing to give. Gray Horse spoke without waiting for translation. Eli said, he says this isn't only your problem. He says Blackwood has been pushing his family's settlement for a year. He's not here for you. He's here for himself. Isaac Porter said. Same. Nobody turned back. Gina stayed at the ranch. This was not a fight she could join on horseback across 15 miles of open terrain. She knew that. She accepted it with the same practicality she brought to the rest of it. But she did not do nothing. She sat at the surviving section of the kitchen table with her papers and her pen, and she began writing. The legal argument she had been building for 2 weeks, the one they had been preparing to bring to Denver, she reorganized it around last night's events. The fire was evidence. The boot prints under the kitchen window were evidence. The button was evidence. Tessa's testimony was evidence. Her own account was evidence. She wrote it all out in the clear, organized prose that her father had taught her: facts first, sequence second, argument third, conclusion supported by everything above it. She wrote for 3 hours without stopping. Tessa sat with her. The girl had moved past the initial uncertainty of her returned voice and was using it with increasing steadiness, asking questions when she had them, going quiet when she was thinking, answering directly when spoken to. The locked child of 7 weeks ago was still visible in the carefulness of her, but something else was coming through it now, something that had been underneath all along waiting. Miss Gina, she said, midway through the morning. Gina kept writing. When this is over, Tessa said, are you going to leave? Gina stopped writing. She looked at Tessa. The girl was looking at her with the straight-on, unhedged directness she brought to questions that mattered, the questions she had clearly been sitting with for a while. I don't have anywhere to leave to, Gina said. Not yet. My home is complicated at the moment, but when it's not complicated anymore. Gina put her pen down. She turned to face the girl properly. I don't know exactly what comes next, she said. That's the honest answer. When your father and I have settled the legal situation, when the land is properly mine and the court has ruled, then I'll have choices I don't have now. She paused. What I can tell you is that whatever I decide, I'll tell you myself. You won't hear it from someone else, and you won't come downstairs one morning and find me gone. She held the girl's gaze. I know what it's like to have people disappear without warning. I won't do that. Tessa looked at her for a long time. Okay, she said. She went back to her drawing, but she moved her chair slightly closer to Gina's before she did. Cal came back mid-afternoon with Eli. Gina was out in the yard when she heard the horses, and she was at the fence before they reached it. The others, she said. Still at the canyon, Cal said, climbing down. We rode back to report. He tied the horse to the post. We found them. Reed's camp is in the North Canyon Fork, about 2 miles in. 4 men, armed. They've set up a defensive position. They're not planning to move soon. Reed is there. His horse is there. Gray Horse confirmed it. And Harker? Holding position at the canyon entrance with the others. Cal looked at her. He sent a message. He produced a folded piece of paper. She opened it. Harker's handwriting was plain and functional, exactly what she would have expected. Send word to Territorial Marshal's office in Denver. Use my name and military service number. Cal knows it. Tell them we have a confirmed location on Reed Blackwood in connection with arson and assault at Ironwood Creek Ranch. We need 2 deputies minimum. They can reach the canyon entrance by tomorrow afternoon if they ride today. Don't wait for me to come back first. Send Moss with the letter. H.V. Peace. How are the documents coming? She looked at the postscript for a moment. She turned the paper over and wrote on the back. Documents are coming well. I've incorporated last night's evidence. Moss is leaving within the hour. Stay at the canyon entrance. She paused. Then she added, be careful. She folded it and gave it back to Cal. Tell Moss to ride fast, she said. Moss was saddled and gone within 20 minutes. She went back inside and kept writing. The afternoon was long, the kind of long that is measured in coffee cups and pages and the position of the sun through the window rather than in clock time. She wrote the full account of the fraudulent incompetence document, the context in which she had signed it, what she had been told versus what it actually said, the specific legal argument for why duress and misrepresentation voided a signature under territorial law. She wrote the account of the evening on the prairie, the abandoned trunk, the missing identification papers, the pattern of deliberate abandonment. She wrote last night in careful sequence. By the time the sun was dropping toward the horizon, she had 14 pages. Clean, organized, argued. The kind of document that a judge would be able to read without confusion, and that would be very difficult to successfully argue against, because it did not rely on sympathy. It relied on fact and sequence and law. Her father would have been satisfied with it. She sat back and read it through once. Then she added a final section, an accounting literal, in the format she used for the ledgers of the silver deposit value, as she had calculated it from the assay report figures Harker had shown her, the value of what Blackwood and Clement were actually after. Numbers, precise and documented. Because juries and judges were human beings, and human beings understood a motive better when they could see it expressed as a figure. She wrote the figure at the bottom of the final page and underlined it twice. Tessa had fallen asleep on the settle by the fire sometime in the late afternoon. Gina covered her with the wool blanket from the back of the chair and left her. She went to the window and looked out at the east pasture. The oak trees stood in the evening light, unchanged. The plank benches were still there, and Cal's blackboard between its 2 stakes. The ground around it was still cleared and flat. Monday, she had told Isaac Porter. School Monday, the house was half burned. They were leaving for Denver in, she recalculated, 2 days, maybe 3, depending on when Harker came back from the canyon. The legal situation was not resolved. Her Uncle Clement was still somewhere with fraudulent documents and her father's stolen property. She looked at the oak tree. Monday, she had said. She meant it. At dusk, she heard more horses coming from the northwest. She was at the door before they reached the yard. Harker was in front, riding the bay. He was dusty and tired-looking, and his hat was pushed back, and when he saw her standing in the doorway, he pulled up and sat on his horse for a moment, just looking at her, the same way she was looking at him. The others came in behind him, Gray Horse and the young tracker, Isaac Porter, and his sons. They looked road-worn and serious and functional, the look of people who had done a hard day's work. Harker dismounted and handed the bay's reins to Eli and came to the door. Everyone's back? Gina said. Everyone's back. He stopped in front of her. Up close, she could see the dust on his face and the tiredness around his eyes and something else underneath. That, a steadiness that had been tested tonight and had held. Reed still at the canyon, still there. Gray Horse left 2 of his men watching the entrance. They'll hold until the marshal's deputies arrive. He looked at her hands. You sent Moss 3 hours ago. She stepped back to let him in. The documents are done. 14 pages, plus the financial summary. He came inside. He looked at the papers on the table. He picked up the top page and read the first 2 paragraphs. He set it down. This is good, he said, and from Harker Vane, who did not decorate his opinions, that meant it was exactly what it needed to be. It's accurate, she said, which is better than good. He almost smiled. tired and dusty, and coming off 15 miles and a tense afternoon holding position at a canyon entrance, and he still almost smiled. Tessa stirred on the settle. She pushed herself upright and blinked. She saw her father and woke up the rest of the way immediately. He went to her and sat beside her, and she leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they stayed like that, not talking, just present with each other, while Gina poured coffee for the men coming in from outside. Isaac Porter paused at the door before going to the bunkhouse with the others. "Denver," he said to Gina, "you need a statement from a neighboring landowner about Blackwood's land registry practices." She looked at him. "I would be very grateful for that statement. I'll write it tonight," he said. "My handwriting isn't pretty, but the content will be clear." "Clear is better than pretty," she said. He nodded and went out. She stood in the kitchen doorway, or what remained of it, with her coffee, and looked at the last of the evening light going out of the sky. The burned wing was a dark shape to the east. The oak tree was a darker shape against the pasture. The stars were coming in above it all, reliable and enormous. Tomorrow, final preparations. The day after, if the marshal's confirmation came, Denver. She had 14 pages and a financial summary and the testimony of a 7-year-old girl who had noticed a gray horse with a blaze mark and a military button in the dirt, and the corroborating statement of a neighboring landowner and a man with a military service record and a property bond who was willing to stand beside her in a territorial court. She thought about Clement, comfortable somewhere. Assuming she was managed, she thought about Orson Blackwood in his office in Ironwood Town, waiting for a report that the problem had been resolved. She picked up her pen from beside the papers and made a small correction to paragraph 6. The word she had used was approximate where a precise word existed. She replaced it. Better, she set the pen down. In the main room, she could hear Harker's low voice and Tessa's rougher, newer one, talking quietly about something she couldn't hear. It was the sound of the house in the evening, and she had learned its rhythm, and she stood in the damaged kitchen and listened to it for a moment before going back to work. Tomorrow they would finish preparing. The day after, they would go. She was ready. The marshal's deputies arrived the next afternoon. 2 of them, riding hard from Denver, with the dust of 40 miles on their coats and the particular no-nonsense expression of men who had done this kind of work long enough to arrive at efficiency over theater. Deputy Marshal Cord Haynes was the senior 150s, gray-bearded, built like someone had stacked rocks carefully. His partner, younger, said almost nothing and watched everything. They read Gina's 14 pages on horseback, passing them back and forth while Harker talked them through the situation. Haynes asked 3 questions, all of them specific. He took the military button Tessa had found. He took Gina's signed account of the previous night. He looked at the burned wing of the house. "We'll ride to the canyon tonight," he said. "Position at first light. You'll hold back until we have them in hand." "Agreed," Harker said. They rode at 3 in the morning. The cold hit hard before dawn. Colorado in late September had no patience for the warmth of the day before. By the time they reached the canyon entrance, the temperature had dropped 40 degrees from the afternoon high, and the first thin snow of the season was coming in sideways from the northwest. The flakes small and serious, nothing decorative about them. Gina had come. Harker had not argued about it, which she had been prepared for. He had looked at her when she appeared in her riding coat at the barn, with her horse saddled, and he had said, "Stay inside the canyon entrance until Haynes moves," and that had been the extent of the discussion. She had the Derringer and 4 reloaded chambers and her 14 pages in the oilskin bag across her saddle, because she was not leaving the documents at a half-burned ranch house while she rode into the mountains. The canyon was a narrow cut through limestone that deepened as you went north, the walls rising from 10 feet to 50 over the course of a mile. The floor was rocky and uneven, and in the dark their horses picked their way carefully, hooves on stone, making the only sound besides the wind. Gray Horse's 2 men were still at the position he had left them. They reported that Reed's camp had not moved. 4 men, fire banked low, horses still in the draw to the west. Haynes positioned his forces with the same economy. Harker used no extra motion, nothing wasted. He and his partner went east along the canyon rim. Cal and Moss took the western approach. Isaac Porter and his sons held the canyon entrance. Gray Horse and his men moved to cover the draw where the horses were. Harker and Gina were to wait at the canyon entrance with the Porters until it was done. The pre-dawn held them all in its cold dark. At first light, not sunrise, just the first dilution of the black, into a deep gray Haines moved. It was fast. It was not clean. Reed Blackwood's men were not asleep. One of them was on watch, which Haines had assumed and accounted for. But the watchman saw Moss coming over the western rim earlier than expected, and the shouting started before Haines had his position fully established. Gina heard it from the canyon entrance. Gunshots, 3 in quick succession, then a gap, then 2 more. Then Haines' voice, loud and commanding, calling for surrender, then more shots. Harker was already moving. He looked back at her once. "Stay," he said. She did not stay. She gave him 30 seconds and then followed. The canyon floor opened into a wider space about a quarter mile in where the walls drew back, and a flat area of maybe 50 yards across sat against the base of the north wall. This was Reed's camp. She could see it as she came around the bend, the banked fire, the bedrolls, the horses rearing in the draw. The situation was not resolved. 2 of Reed's men had their hands up. Haines had them at gunpoint, his partner beside him. Cal and Moss were somewhere above on the west rim, visible as movement. Reed Blackwood was on the ground with a leg wound, trying to get up, his gun still in his hand. And Harker was 10 feet from him, coming in fast, and the 4th man, the one Gina had not yet located, was on the east rim above them, with his rifle up, and Harker had not seen him. Harker had not seen him. She saw it all in the space of 2 running steps. She pulled the derringer. Reed got upright. His leg was bleeding badly, but he was standing, and the gun was coming up toward Harker, toward the space between his shoulder blades. And the man on the rim was also raising his rifle. And there were 2 of them, and 1 of Harker. And he still had not seen either. She fired. The shot hit Reed's gun hand. He dropped the weapon. He went down screaming, his right hand clenched against his chest. The gun skidded across the rock floor of the canyon. Harker spun. He saw Reed on the ground and the dropped gun, and Gina standing at the canyon entrance with the derringer still raised. And then he did what a cavalryman does when the threat picture changes. He did not stop to process it. He looked for the next threat, and he found it. The man on the east rim. He went sideways and drew and fired in one movement. The man on the rim went down. Not dead shoulder wound, he learned later, but out of the fight. Then it was over. The silence after gunfire always felt wrong, too large for what it was asked to hold. The wind came through the canyon and pushed the gunsmoke sideways, and the horses in the draw settled slowly, and Reed Blackwood was on the canyon floor with his hand bleeding and his leg bleeding, and whatever plan he had carried into these rocks finished. Harker walked to Gina. She had lowered the derringer. Her arm was steady. Her face was, she checked. She was surprised to find also steady. Not calm, exactly. More like very present, every detail sharp and close and real. He stopped in front of her. He looked at the derringer in her hand. He looked at Reed on the ground. He looked at her. "His gun hand," he said. "I aimed for the gun," she said. "I hit the hand. That's a harder shot." It was closer to me. She met his eyes. "Are you hit?" "No, good." She put the derringer back in her pocket. He looked at her for another moment. There was something in his face that was not yet words. She understood it was not yet words and left it alone. Haines came across the canyon floor with his partner, both men businesslike, and began the process of getting everyone restrained and accounted for. Reed's hand wound was bound. His leg was assessed and bound. As well, he had taken a graze from Haines' first shot when things had started fast and wrong. He was not in danger of dying. He was not going to be comfortable for a while either. He looked at Harker when Harker crouched in front of him. "Finish it," Reed said. His voice was tight with pain, but the anger underneath was older and had nothing to do with the hand. "I'm not finishing anything," Harker said. "You're going to Denver in Haines' custody, and you're going to face a court. You left her on that road." "I know what I did," Harker said. He was very quiet saying it. "I have not had a single day in 3 years where I didn't know what I did. That is mine to carry, and I will carry it." He looked at his late wife's brother with the kind of steadiness that costs something to maintain. But Eleanor would not have wanted this. What you've built from her death, she would not have wanted it. Reed looked away. She loved you, Harker said. She talked about you every time she got a letter from home. He stood up. I'm sorry she's gone. I will always be sorry she's gone. He paused. That's all I have. He walked away. Gina was watching from several feet back, where she had positioned herself to give them the space the conversation required. When Harker came back to her, she fell into step beside him, and they walked toward the canyon entrance together, back the way they had come, with the early season snow still coming in thin and sideways, and the canyon walls gray and high around them. After a moment, he said, You were supposed to stay at the entrance. I know, she said. You could have been shot, so could you, she said. From behind, which is what was about to happen. He was quiet. I had the shot, she said. I took it. More quiet. They walked. The snow was fine and cold on her face. Thank you, he said. You're welcome, she said. They came out of the canyon into the gray morning, and the wide open land ran south, and the snow blew across it in cold, thin sheets. Their horses were waiting where they had left them. She mounted up and he mounted up, and they turned south toward home. Back to back, she thought, the outline of it. She and Harker in a canyon, back to back. She had not planned it. Plans rarely survived contact with the actual situation. But they had been back to back, and both of them were still here, and Reed Blackwood was in Haynes' custody, and that was the arithmetic of the morning. She rode south into the cold and found it was enough. Denver was 3 days' ride in good weather. They made it in 2.5, pushing harder than comfort preferred, because Haynes had sent a rider ahead with the formal arrest report, and the territorial court moved faster when a deputy marshal's name was on the filing. The city appeared in the late afternoon of the second day larger than Ironwood town by an order of magnitude, brick buildings and telegraph lines, and more horses and wagons in one street than the entire Ironwood Creek territory could produce. Tessa, who had never been to a city, stood up in the wagon as they came down the main approach and looked at everything simultaneously with the focused attention of a person trying to record it all at once. It's loud, she said. It is, Gina agreed. Is Boston louder? Boston is louder. Tessa considered that. How did you think? Ganna looked at her. That is a very good question, she said. I'm not entirely sure I did. They stayed at a boarding house that Harker knew from prior trips. The owner, a woman named Mrs. Fenn, looked at their road-worn state and Tessa's serious face and Gina's oilskin document bag and produced hot food and clean rooms without requiring explanation. Some people have the quality of understanding that not every situation wants narrating. Mrs. Fenn had it. The court date was set for Thursday. Today was Tuesday. 48 hours. Gina spent them working. She had 14 pages. She reorganized them for the third time, this time with the specific structure of a territorial court proceeding in mind. She had read enough law. Her father's library had included Blackstone and several territorial code volumes to know that a court did not want a story. It wanted a sequence of facts, each one supported, each one connected to the legal claim it established. She worked Tuesday evening and most of Wednesday. Harker brought her food. She ate it without looking up. He sat across from her sometimes and read through drafts she handed him and made comments in the margin in his plain functional handwriting. Good comments. The kind that found the place where an argument was almost right and told you exactly why almost was not enough. Isaac Porter's statement arrived by telegraph. Wednesday morning he had ridden to the Ironwood town telegraph office himself to send it, which required more courage than it might seem given the current political situation there. Mrs. Aldridge from the general store had apparently witnessed the sending and added her own brief statement about the warrant confrontation in her store. Haynes had filed the criminal report, which was now part of the court record. Wednesday evening, Gina set her pen down and read the full document straight through. It's ready, she said. Harker read it. He read all of it, every page, without speaking. She watched him, read. When he finished, he set it on the table and looked at her. You built a case, he said. That's what the facts support, she said. Your relative's lawyer is going to try to rattle you, he said. That's the only strategy left to them. The documents are thin. Their witnesses are gone. Blackwood is in custody. All they have is you on the stand. I know. They'll say you're excitable, prone to misinterpretation, that you misunderstood what you signed. He looked at her steadily. They'll use words like hysterical. I know what words they'll use, she said. I've been hearing those words my entire life. She met his eyes. They tend to have less effect when you're holding 14 pages of organized legal argument. He almost smiled. Then he did smile briefly, completely, and it changed his face in the way it always did when he let it through. Get some sleep, he said, in a moment. She sat for a while after he went upstairs. The boarding house was quiet around her. Denver made its sounds outside distant, complicated, the sounds of a city that did not stop. She thought about her father, his library, the Blackstone volumes and the arithmetic texts and the philosophy books and the novels he had said were as educational as anything else because they taught you how people actually worked. She thought about sitting at his desk as a child, the age Tessa was now, and being shown how to balance a household account as though it were perfectly natural for a 9-year-old girl in Boston to know such a thing. He had known. He had always known that the world would try to make her smaller than she was, and he had spent her entire childhood handing her tools for when that happened. Tomorrow she would use them. The Territorial Court of Colorado sat in a 3-story brick building on the north side of Denver's main square. It smelled of wood polish and paper, and the particular institutional gravity of a place where decisions were made that lasted. The ceiling in the main courtroom was high enough to make the room feel serious about itself. Judge Elias Crane was 60, small, with the precise economy of movement of a man who had been making consequential decisions for 30 years and had lost patience with anything that wasted his time. He looked at Gina when she was sworn in with the expression of a person conducting an assessment, not a performance. Clement Rourke was at the far table with his lawyer, a man from Boston who had come all this way, which told Gina how much money was actually at stake. Clement himself looked the same, as always neat, pleasant, the surface of a man that concealed the architecture beneath it. He watched her take the stand with the careful neutrality of someone who had already decided what was going to happen. She looked at him once, then she looked at the judge. Her own lawyer was a Denver man named Whitfield, recommended by Haynes, small and meticulous and quietly formidable. He had read her documents Tuesday night and had met her Wednesday morning with the expression of someone who had revised their expectations upward. The first 2 hours were the foundational material. Whitfield walked her through the sequence, her parents' deaths, the estate, Clement's management of it, the document she had been asked to sign. She answered every question directly, without elaboration, the way her father had taught her, say what you know, stop when you've said it, don't fill silence with speculation. The judge interrupted 3 times, each time with a precise question. Each time she answered it directly. Then Clement's lawyer stood up. He was a tall man, Boston polish on everything, and he had the particular practiced gentleness of someone who intended to be very unkind. Miss Prescott, he said, you've described a document that you claim misrepresented its purpose. Is it possible, given the grief you were experiencing at the time of your parents' passing, that you simply misread it? No, she said. He smiled. You seem very certain. I am certain, she said. I read the document 3 times before signing it. I have a strong memory for written text. I can reproduce the language of that document from memory, if it would assist the court. He paused. The pause was small, but she caught it. That won't be necessary, he began. Page 2, paragraph 3, she said, looking at the judge, not the lawyer. It reads, and I quote from memory, Your Honor, the undersigned, being of diminished mental and emotional capacity as certified herein, does surrender management of all property and financial assets to the designated custodian, Mr. Clement Rourke, in perpetuity. The word perpetuity was underlined in the original. The word diminished appeared nowhere. In the document was told I was signing. The lawyer tried again. He tried 4 different approaches over the next hour. Each time she answered with facts. When he suggested she was misremembering, she cited the specific page and paragraph. When he suggested she had misunderstood the legal terminology, she defined the terminology. When he suggested that a young woman recently bereaved might be expected to need guidance in managing a complex estate, she looked at him and said, "I managed my father's accounts for 6 years under his supervision and maintained them without error. The estate in question requires basic arithmetic and a calendar. Neither task exceeds my demonstrated competence." In the gallery, she heard someone make a sound. She did not look. The lawyer tried once more. He leaned slightly forward, and his voice went to something that was meant to sound sympathetic. "Miss Prescott, your experiences in the Colorado Territory over the past months have been, by your own account, quite dramatic. The Prairie, the fire, the confrontation at Devil's Canyon. Isn't it possible that these events have shaped your testimony in ways you may not fully appreciate?" She looked at him. "My experiences in the Colorado Territory," she said carefully, "include being abandoned on a prairie in July with a sprained ankle and no identification papers, being the subject of a fraudulent lunacy warrant, surviving an arson attack on the home where I was staying, and assisting in the apprehension of the man responsible, who is now in territorial custody." She paused. "None of those experiences have altered the content of the document I signed in Boston 14 months ago. They have, however, given me considerable practice in remaining clear-headed under difficult circumstances. If that's your concern, I think it actually strengthens my testimony rather than weakening it." The gallery was very quiet. Judge Crane looked at the lawyer. The look was brief and informative. The lawyer sat down. Whitfield stood. He looked at his notes, then set them down. "Miss Prescott," he said, "one final question. The property at Copper Ridge, including the silver deposit, what do you intend to do with it?" She had not been warned about this question. She looked at Whitfield and understood that it was deliberate. He wanted the answer unrehearsed. "Develop it responsibly," she said, "under proper territorial mining regulations. The revenue from it will support the school I've established on the neighboring property, expand it into a proper building, and fund the education of children who currently have no other access to one." She paused. "After expenses, including any legal costs of this proceeding." Whitfield nodded and sat. Then Harker stood. He was not her lawyer, and he was not on the witness list, and Judge Crane looked at him with the expression of a man whose courtroom was acquiring complications. "Your Honor," Harker said. His voice was the same as always, level carrying the voice of a man who did not need volume to be heard. "I'd like to give a brief statement if the court will allow it. As a property bondholder and military veteran of record in this territory." Crane looked at him for a moment. "1 minute, Mr. Vane." Harker turned slightly, so he was addressing the room as much as the bench. "A woman is not the property of her parents, her uncles, or any husband," he said. "She belongs to herself. The law exists to protect the life and liberty of every human being, not to serve as a tool for the powerful to oppress the weak." He sat down. The courtroom held that for a moment. Clement's lawyer stood as if to object, and then appeared to reconsider what exactly he was going to object to. Judge Crane looked at him. "Is that a comment, counselor?" The lawyer sat back down. Crane looked at his papers. He looked at Gina's 14 pages, which had been entered as evidence and which he had read, she had been told, the previous evening in his chambers. He looked at Clement. "Mr. Rourke," he said, "the certification of mental incompetence attached to this document carries the names of 2 physicians. Both of those physicians, I note, maintain offices in the same building as your law firm in Boston. I also note that neither physician appears in any Massachusetts medical registry I've been able to access." He set the papers down. "Would you like to explain that to this court?" Clement's pleasant surface did not quite hold. He spoke to his lawyer. His lawyer spoke back. The exchange was brief and went nowhere useful. The judge ruled before noon. The incompetence declaration was found fraudulent and void. Gina's legal standing as her father's heir was fully restored. The Copper Ridge land claim was confirmed in her name. Clement Rourke was remanded to custody on charges of fraud and conspiracy, to be transferred to Boston for additional proceedings related to the estate. The warrant that had been issued by Mayor Orson Blackwood, who was simultaneously being processed by Haynes' office on arson and conspiracy charges, was declared invalid and expunged. She sat at the plaintiff's table when it was done and looked at the papers Whitfield was organizing in front of her. She heard Tessa's voice from the gallery. Papa, what does it mean? And Harker's answer, low and clear. It means it's over. She won. She sat with that for a moment. She had not planned to cry. She was not someone who cried easily, and she had used up a considerable portion of her available capacity for it over the last 14 months. But something released in her chest when she heard those words she won, and her eyes went warm. And she pressed two fingers to her mouth and looked at the ceiling of the courtroom for a moment until it passed. Then she straightened her papers and stood up and turned around. Harker was at the gallery railing with Tessa beside him. He was watching her. His face was open in the way it went sometimes when something had reached past the careful composure he generally kept. She walked toward him and he came around the railing to meet her. They stopped in front of each other. She thought about the first time she had seen his face, coming at her across the heat and distance of the Colorado prairie, the hands raised and empty, the first words he had spoken. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he agreed. Tessa slipped between them and wrapped both arms around Gina's waist and pressed her face against her side. Gina put her hand on the back of the girl's head. They stood in the courtroom in Denver, while the legal machinery of a recovered life settled around them. And outside the high windows, the city went about its business. And it was enough. They went home. It took 3 weeks to fully get there. There was the business in Denver, first the deed transfer, the land office confirmation, the meetings with Whitfield about the remaining Boston proceedings, the telegraph to Mrs. Aldridge, who sent back a response that was 1 sentence long and required no elaboration, about time. School better be open. There was also the repaired locket. Harker found a silversmith on Denver's 2nd Street who looked at the broken chain and the dented case and said he could have it right in a day. Gina sat in the man's small shop and watched him work, and when he handed it back to her with the chain whole and the case burnished out and the hinge moving cleanly, she held it for a moment and then put it on. She kept it on. The ride back to Ironwood Creek was easier than the ride out had been, which was not a function of the weather. Autumn had settled firmly and the mornings were cold and honest about it. It was easier because the weight that had been there on the outbound journey was gone. The documents in the oilskin bag were finished documents now, resolved, producing a different quality of silence than the unfinished ones had. Tessa talked almost the whole way. She had discovered, in Denver, that her voice was a thing with range and variety, and she was exploring it the way you explore a room you have been locked out of for years and have finally gotten back into. She asked questions about everything she had seen. She described things she had noticed and wanted to discuss. She told Gina about a dream she'd had, and then asked Gina what she thought it meant, which launched a conversation about dreams and memory, and the way the mind organized things during sleep that lasted most of the afternoon of the 2nd day. Harker rode mostly in a comfortable quiet beside the wagon, listening to them talk. When Ironwood Creek came into view on the 3rd afternoon, Gina saw it differently than she had the first time. The first time it had been relief solid, real, a place to stop in. Now it was something else. The word that came was home, and she let it stay without arguing with it. The burned wing was visible from the road. Cal had stabilized the standing walls and covered the exposed sections with tarps to keep the autumn weather out. He had also, characteristically, left a note on the kitchen table that simply, east wall structurally sound, salvageable. I've drawn up a plan. She read the note twice and felt a specific affection for Cal that she suspected would last her entire life. The community arrived the following Saturday. She had not arranged it. She had not known it was happening. She came out of the surviving West Wing at 7 in the morning to find Gray Horse and 6 men from the Creek settlement in the yard with tools and timber. Isaac Porter's wagon came up the road at 7:30 with lumber from the mill in Ironwood Town, which Mrs. Aldridge had apparently organized and which Isaac had apparently funded at least partly from his own pocket, the details of which he refused to discuss when she tried to raise them. Eli had gotten word to the neighboring homesteads. The families came, Henry's family and Marcus's family, Suki's mother and the other settlement women, 3 men Gina had never seen before, who turned out to be cousins of Gray Horse who had heard there was building to be done. By 8 in the morning, there were 32 people in the yard of Ironwood Creek Ranch. Gina stood on the porch and looked at all of them. Cal came to stand beside her. He was holding his building plan. "Tell me where you want the schoolroom," he said. She looked at him. "East wing," he said patiently. "If we're rebuilding it anyway. A proper room. Good windows for light. Big enough for 20 students." He showed her the plan. He had already sketched it in. She looked at the drawing and saw that he had put bookshelves on 2 walls and a proper board on the third and windows on the south side for maximum winter light. She looked at this plan for a long moment. "Cal," she said. "Miss Prescott, when did you draw this?" "Week before the fire," he said. "Had a feeling it would come up." She pressed her lips together and looked at the plan again, and then at the yard full of people. "The south windows," she said. "Make them bigger." "Already planned on it," he said. The building took 3 Saturdays. The first Saturday was the frame and the floor. The second was the walls and the roof. The third was the finishing the bookshelves that Cal built with a precision that was almost architectural. The south windows that were large enough to flood the room with winter light, the blackboard mounted on the west wall, at the right height for a standing teacher and a child seated. Tessa helped every Saturday. She carried things and fetched things and held things when 2 pairs of hands were needed, and she talked to people and answered questions and told Marcus's little sister the names of all the tools and what they were for in the serious instructional voice she had apparently absorbed from somewhere nearby. Gina worked beside whoever needed an extra pair of hands. She had calluses now. Her hands were different than the Boston hands she had arrived, with harder on the palms, more capable. The burned blister from that first match, long ago absorbed into the general toughening of someone who had been doing real work for 3 months. She swung a hammer tolerably well by the 3rd Saturday. Cal watched her technique and said nothing, which meant it was acceptable. Orson Blackwood was transferred to federal custody in November on the arson charges and the land registry fraud. His brother Reed faced charges in Denver: arson, assault, conspiracy. Gina was not at that proceeding. Whitfield represented the relevant interest. He sent a telegraph when it was done. She read it at the kitchen table. Harker came in from outside and saw her holding the paper. "Reed," he said. 5 years, she said. "Federal." He was quiet. She looked at him. "You feel something." "About that he was her brother," he said. "Eleanor would have." He stopped. She would have wanted him to have a life. Not that. "He made choices," Gina said gently. "I know he did." He sat down. "It doesn't mean I can't regret the way it ended." She put the telegraph down. "That's not weakness," she said, holding 2 things at once, knowing someone chose wrong and still being sorry for them. "That's just what being a person is." He looked at her across the table. "You have a way of making the complicated things clear," he said. "I have a lot of practice organizing information," she said. He held her gaze. The kitchen was warm. The new schoolroom on the other side of the east wing wall was waiting for Monday. Outside, the afternoon was clear and cold, and the cattle were in the south pasture, and Scout was asleep on the porch. Harker got up and went to the shelf by the fireplace. He came back to the table. He set 2 things down in front of her. The first was a ring, simple, gold, with a flat band and no excess to it, nothing decorative, nothing performing at wealth. It sat on the table between them and caught the light. The second was a document. She looked at it. Legal paper, properly formatted, signed, and witnessed, and bearing the seal of the Denver Territorial Land Office. She picked it up and read it. It was a deed. Ironwood Creek Ranch. The legal description of the property. All of it. The house and the land and the water rights and the outbuildings and the cattle operation. 2 names were on it. Harker Vane, Genevieve, Ann Prescott, equal co-owners of record, the ownership undivided and the rights identical. She looked up. He was standing on the other side of the table, and he was not performing anything. He was simply there, looking at her with the same qualities she had seen in him from the beginning, the quality of a person who meant what he said and had taken the time to make sure what he said was exactly right. "I had Whitfield draw it up while we were in Denver," he said. "I didn't tell you because I wanted to ask first." She looked at the deed. She looked at the ring. "Ask," she said. He came around the table. He stood in front of her and took both her hands. the deed still in one of them. I didn't rescue you to make you my beholden, he said. I want you to stay because you choose me, as two free human beings, walking the same path together. She looked at him. She thought about everything between that first Prairie afternoon and this kitchen, the chopping block, and the ledgers, and the derringer practice, and the barn beam, and the root cellar, and the canyon, and the courtroom. She thought about 14 pages of organized argument, and a child who had said "my mouth forgot," and a dead tree branch she had held in both hands, and a man who had raised his empty palms. She had been given, over the course of her life, a great deal of advice about what love was supposed to look like. Most of it had been about what a woman should accept and be grateful for. Very little of it had looked anything like this. This looked like a deed with her name on it. Yes, she said. She said it the same way, She said everything she meant plainly. No. Elaboration. He took the deed from her hand and set it on the table, and kept her hands in his. The wedding was 3 weeks later. It was a Saturday, which was also a school day, because the students were there, and it seemed right that they should be. The oak tree presided over it, bare of leaves now in late November, but still standing. The ground beneath it swept clear, and the plank benches arranged in the arc that was their usual school configuration. Everyone came, Gray Horse and his family, and the settlement people, the Porters. All of them, Isaac, in a clean shirt that he had pressed himself. Mrs. Aldridge had ridden out from town, which surprised Gina, and then didn't. Cal wore his good coat, which she had not known he had. Eli stood with Moss at the edge of the gathering, and both of them seemed to find the ground near their boots very interesting throughout the ceremony. The minister from Ironwood Town performed it. Short, plain, the words that mattered and no others. Tessa stood beside Gina and held her flowers, which were dried autumn things that Mrs. Aldridge had brought, tied with a piece of blue ribbon. She stood very straight and very still, and when the minister said the final words and Harker put the ring on Gina's finger, Tessa looked up at Gina with her gray-green eyes, wide and bright. You stayed, she said. Gina looked down at her. I stayed. Tessa nodded, deeply satisfied with this, as though it confirmed something she had known for a while, and had simply been waiting for the official version of afterward in the schoolroom, because it was new and large and warm, and the obvious place the community ate together. Food that people had brought, more than there was room for on the tables. The surplus stacked on Cal's beautiful bookshelves next to the primers and the arithmetic workbooks and the spellers. Marcus Porter found Gina near the window at some point in the middle of it. He was taller than when school had started, or she had gotten used to looking at him as her student and was now seeing him more accurately. He had a piece of pie in his hand, and he looked at her with the straight-on directness she had always appreciated in him. School's still Monday, he said. School is still Monday, she said. We're going to fractions? You're ready for fractions, she said. Yes. He considered this. My daddy says you're the best teacher in the county. Your daddy hasn't met all the teachers in the county. Neither have you, he pointed out. She looked at him for a moment. Fair point, she said. He took a bite of pie and looked out the south window at the bare oak tree and the dry November grass beyond it and the enormous open sky. This room is better than the oak tree, he said. In winter, yes. Is the oak tree still the school in summer? Both, she said. Depending on the day, he nodded. This seemed right to him. He finished his pie and went back to find his brothers. Harker came to stand beside her at the window. The room was full of noise and warmth behind them. Tessa was teaching Suki a hand game of some kind, both of them very serious about the rules. Cal was talking to Gray Horse in the slow cross-language way they had developed over 3 building Saturdays. Isaac Porter was telling someone a story with his hands moving. Harker looked out the south window at the pasture and the oak tree. I've been thinking about the east fence, he said. She looked at him. The post spacing is wrong by the south gate, he said. It's been off since I bought the place. I keep meaning to fix it. She looked at him for a moment. You're thinking about the fence. I'm always thinking about the fence. Ranch doesn't stop needing attention because there's a wedding. He glanced at her. I thought we'd take it together. Monday after school. She looked at the east pasture through the window. The fence line in question was visible from here, the slight irregularity in the post-spacing that she had noticed herself weeks ago and filed away. Monday after school, she said. He put his hand over hers on the windowsill. Outside, the November wind moved across the Colorado grass and pressed against the new room's south windows, and the light was thin and clear the way winter light was, and the oak tree held its bare branches up against the sky the way it always had and always would. She thought about the morning on the prairie, the heat and the dust, and the branch in her hands, and the rider coming from the north. She thought about how certain she had been in that moment that the story she was in was one of loss. She had been wrong. She looked at the room full of people. She looked at the oak tree. She looked at Harker beside her. She had been entirely, completely, magnificently wrong. The wind outside pressed at the glass, and the room held its warmth, and Tessa laughed at something. Suki did a real laugh, clear and full and unguarded, the laugh of a child who had remembered that laughing was possible, and it carried across the whole room, and everyone who heard it turned toward the sound of it, instinctively, the way you turn toward a fire in the cold. Jenna turned toward it too. Home, the word had been right. She had known it, and she knew it now, and she would know it tomorrow and on every ordinary and extraordinary day that came after, walking the same path with the man beside her, on the land that was both of theirs, in the country that had nearly taken everything, and had instead, by some grace she did not entirely understand, given her this. She held the silver locket at her throat, and she looked at her school and her family and the big, bare, beautiful sky, and she let herself at last all the way in. There's a moment near the end of Genevieve Prescott's story that stays with me longer than the gunfight, longer than the courtroom, longer than the fire. It's a quiet moment. She's standing at a window in a room full of people she loves, and a little girl named Tessa, a child, who hadn't spoken a single word in 3 years, laughs out loud. A real laugh, full and unguarded, and every person in that room turns toward the sound of it the way you turn toward a fire in the cold. That image is the whole story, really. People turning toward warmth. People choosing, again and again, to move toward light instead of away from it. Because here's what this story is actually about. It isn't about a woman who survived. Plenty of people survive. It's about a woman who refused to let survival be the ceiling. Gina was left on a prairie with nothing, no papers, no money, no proof of who she was. The people who were supposed to protect her had stripped her of everything they could legally take. And she stood up anyway. She wrapped her own ankle with a strip of silk, picked up a dead branch, and stood her ground. Not because she wasn't afraid, she absolutely was, but because she understood something that took me years of writing to learn how to put into words. Fear is information. What you do with it is yours. That's the first lesson this story gives us. Courage is not the absence of fear. It's the decision to keep moving while the fear is loud. Gina was terrified on that prairie. She was terrified in that root cellar, with Tessa pressed against her side and smoke coming through the cracks. She was terrified in that courtroom when a polished lawyer from Boston tried to make her feel small in front of a judge. But she kept her hands steady and her mind clear because she had spent her whole life building tools for exactly those moments, and when the moments came, the tools were already in her. The second lesson is about what real strength looks like between two people. Harker Vane is not the hero of this story in the way the old Western stories used to tell it. He doesn't ride in and save the woman. He rides in and gives her water, and a room with a lock, and a key that belongs to her, and then he steps back and lets her save herself. He teaches her to shoot not so he can control her, but so no one, including himself, he says it plainly, can ever force her into something she doesn't choose. That is love as respect. That is partnership as something built on equal ground. In a world that was doing everything in its power to make Gina small, Harker kept handing her tools and standing beside her. Not in front of her, beside her, and that made all the difference. That's what this story gives you if you let it. It gives you a woman who was supposed to be manageable and turned out to be formidable. It gives you a man who understood that the bravest thing he could do was get out of her way and walk beside her. It gives you a child who found her voice in the middle of a thunderstorm and never gave it back. And it gives you a community of people, different families, different histories, different languages, who showed up on a Saturday morning with tools and timber because someone had built something worth protecting, and they all knew it. The prairie in this story doesn't care who you are. It only asks one question: can you survive? Gina's answer, in the end, is better than survival. Her answer is this room full of warmth, this laughing child, this deed with her name on it, this life chosen freely, on her own terms, on ground that belongs to her. That's the only answer worth giving. This story is a work of fiction inspired by the history and landscape of the American West. All characters, events, and situations depicted are entirely imaginary and are not intended to represent any real persons or historical events.